Hello, and welcome back to the Eastern Historian's Bedtime Stories. I'm Jason. Today we're going to hear the complete story of China's Tang Dynasty. If you had to pick the dynasty in Chinese history that feels most like a legend, it would be almost impossible to leave the Tang out. It had one of the most dazzling capitals of the ancient world, camel bells carrying trade westward from Chang'an, poets standing in taverns and writing with breathtaking ambition, and bloody mornings when emperors rode into the heart of power on horseback. People from Central Asia, West Asia, South Asia, and Northeast Asia came to the same city to trade, study, serve in government, or spread their faith. And yet, after one earth-shaking rebellion, the dynasty watched its territory, finances, armies, and imperial authority split apart as if struck by an axe, never fully recovering what it once had. More remarkably, the forces that made the Tang great were often the same forces that helped destroy it. Openness made the empire powerful, but also drew the frontier and the wider world deeply into its fate. Empowering military commanders allowed the dynasty to project force across distant frontiers, but eventually gave regional governors enough power to threaten the central government itself. The civil service examinations and bureaucracy helped emperors recruit talent from across the realm. Yet over time, they also created new factions and new struggles for power. So the real question is not simply how the dynasty rose, flourished, and declined. It is this: why did an empire that had once been so powerful, so confident, and so capable of absorbing the outside world end up being torn apart, piece by piece, by the very forces it had created? And more importantly, when the Tang officially fell in 907, did it really disappear? Or had it already left its institutions, its vision of a city, its literary tastes, its patterns of cultural exchange, and its idea of universal empire deep inside the history of China for the next 1,000 years? Our story begins before the Tang Dynasty even existed. In the late 6th century, China had only just emerged from centuries of division. Emperor Wen of Sui, Yang Jian, founded the Sui dynasty and reunited the north and south. Although this short-lived dynasty lasted only a few decades, it left the future Tang with an enormously important inheritance: a unified imperial framework, a central bureaucracy, the beginnings of the 3 departments and 6 ministries system, an economic network linking north and south through the Grand Canal, and a newly consolidated system of household registration, taxation, and military service. In other words, the Tang did not simply rise from the ruins out of nowhere. It stood on foundations built by the Sui. The problem was that those foundations had barely had time to settle when Emperor Yang of Sui, Yang Guang, pushed the state to the limits of overmobilization, building canals, constructing the eastern capital at Luoyang, making constant imperial tours, and launching massive wars against Goguryeo might not have destroyed a dynasty individually. But taken together, they meant that countless people had to abandon their fields, perform forced labor, transport grain, and serve in the army. The faster the machinery of the state turned, the less room ordinary people had left to endure it. By the end of the Sui, famine, flight, conscription, and the self-defense networks of local elites erupted at the same time, and rebellion spread like wildfire. The Wagong army, Dojinda, Dufuwei, Xueju, Lu Wuzhou, one power after another appeared across the map. The Sui still had an emperor, official institutions, and a capital, but real rule was already beginning to break apart. And at that moment, a man from one of the most powerful aristocratic families of the Guanlong region stepped on a center stage. His name was Li Yuan. He was neither a bandit hero nor a warlord who had suddenly risen from obscurity. His family already had deep kinship and political ties to the Sui imperial house. He himself was serving as governor of Taiyuan, with troops, pedigree, political experience, and an even more formidable son, Li Shimin. In 617, Li Yuan raised an army at Taiyuan. Later historical accounts often leave us with a fascinating question: who was really behind his decision to rebel? Li Shimin, the future Emperor Taizong, eventually became one of the greatest rulers in Chinese history, so official Tang narratives often emphasized his plans and decisiveness, portraying him as the key driving force behind the founding of the dynasty. But in the broader political reality, Li Yuan was hardly a reluctant father dragged into chaos by his son. He had spent years at the center of the collapsing Sui political order. He knew the empire was coming apart, and he understood the strategic importance of Taiyuan. To the north was the pressure of the Turks. To the south lay the direct road toward the Guangzhou heartland. If he seized Chang'an first, he could gain an enormously powerful center of political legitimacy. After raising his army, Li Yuan did not immediately declare himself emperor. Instead, he marched toward Guangzhou in the name of restoring and honoring the Sui. It was a classic political move in a time of civil war. Do not turn every potential rival into a mortal enemy before you have to. In November, Li Yuan captured Chang'an and installed Yang Yu, the grandson of Emperor Yang, as emperor, while holding real power himself. The following year, in 618, Emperor Yang was killed at Jiangdu. The puppet emperor in Chang'an then abdicated, and Li Yuan formally took the throne, proclaimed the new dynasty as Tang, and made Chang'an its capital. The Great Tang had been born, but the words "the Tang Dynasty was founded" can easily create the impression that the whole country simply changed hands. In reality, the Tang of 618 was only one of several competing powers. Outside Chang'an, many regions did not recognize its authority at all. Wang Shichong controlled Luoyang in the east. Dou Jianda held much of Hebei. Xuezhu and Shui dominated the northwest. Lu Wuzhou and other forces were active in the north. What determined whether the Tang could become not merely another regime, but a true dynasty was not the enthronement ceremony. It was the brutal series of wars that followed. In those wars, Li Shimin quickly revealed extraordinary military ability. After Xuezhu died, Li Shimin defeated Shui. When Lu Wuzhou moved south into Bingzhou and Tang forces suffered setbacks, Li Shimin led the counterattack. But the battle that truly reshaped the balance of power was the campaign around Luoyang and Hulao Pass. Wang Shichong held Luoyang, while Dou Jianda marched a large army down from Hebei to relieve him. For Li Shimin, this was both the most dangerous and the most tempting situation. If he continued besieging Luoyang, Dou Jianda could strike him from outside and trap the Tang forces between two armies. If he lifted the siege, all his previous gains might be lost. Li Shimin chose a bold solution. He left part of his army near Luoyang and led his best troops toward Hulao Pass to confront Dou Jianda himself. The terrain around Hulao was difficult, and Li Shimin exploited both the landscape and the exhaustion of an enemy that had marched a long way. He crushed Dou Jianda's army and captured its commander. When the news reached Luoyang, Wang Shicheng knew the game was over and surrendered. This was more than an ordinary victory. It effectively removed the two strongest competitors in northern China at the same time. Afterward, the remaining regional powers were gradually subdued by the later years of Emperor Gaozu's reign. The basic political reunification of China had been achieved. If the story ended there, Li Yuan would look like a successful founder and Li Shimin like an extraordinarily talented prince and commander. But victory created an unavoidable question. Who would inherit the empire? By traditional lineage and political order, the crown prince was Li Jianqing. Yet Li Shimin's achievements in the wars of unification were enormous. The Prince of Qin's household gathered a remarkable group of civilian and military talents, including Fang Xianling, Duru Hui, Yuqi Jingde, and Chang Sunwuji. One crown prince, one battle-hardened Qin prince. Two networks of power were becoming increasingly difficult to fit inside the same city of Chang'an. Prince Qi, Li Yuanji, stood with Li Jianqing. Every appointment, every troop movement, every rumor inside the palace could now be interpreted as a matter of life and death. By 626, the tension finally exploded. On the fourth day of the sixth lunar month, soldiers loyal to Li Shimin staged a coup at Xuanwu Gate on the northern side of the imperial palace. Li Shimin struck first, shooting and killing Crown Prince Li Jianqing, while Yuqi Jingde and others killed Li Yuanji. Li Shimin then seized control of the situation. Li Yuan made him crown prince, and soon afterward abdicated in his favor. Li Shimin became emperor. He would be remembered as Emperor Taizong of Tang. The incident at Xuanwu Gate is one of the bloodstains in Tang history that is hardest to romanticize. Later generations could praise Taizong's achievements as a ruler, but they also had to acknowledge that his reign began with a coup in which brothers killed brothers. That contradiction became the deepest undertone of Li Shimin's life. He had to prove that a throne won through extraordinary means could produce political results greater than an ordinary succession ever could. The Zhenguan era, therefore, is not simply the story of a wise emperor in a golden age. It is also the story of an emperor repeatedly using the results of good government to prove the legitimacy of how he had come to power. When Li Shimin became emperor, the empire had barely crawled out of the wars that had destroyed the sway. The population had fallen sharply, farmland lay abandoned, state finances were strained, and the frontiers were unstable. What stands out about Taizong is not that he inherited a strong state from the beginning, but that he understood what the country needed most: recovery. The court emphasized lighter taxes and labor burdens, reformed the bureaucracy, and encouraged agricultural production. Around the emperor was a group of officials who could speak bluntly and get things done. Fang Xianling was a master strategist, Duru Hui a decisive administrator, Chang Sunwuji one of the emperor's most trusted allies, while Wei Zhang became the most famous image of an outspoken remonstrating official in later history. Wei Zhang had originally served in Li Jianqing's faction, yet after the Xuanwu Gate coup, Li Shimin brought him into his own service. That detail reveals something important about Zhenguan politics. Li Shimin did not require every talented man to prove that he had always been absolutely loyal to the Qin prince's household. What mattered more was whether that talent could now be used by the imperial government. The historical record preserves countless arguments between Li Shimin and Wei Zhang. Some were undoubtedly polished by later generations, but but together they shaped an important political ideal. An emperor could be powerful without hearing only what pleased him, and officials could submit to the throne without surrendering their ability to correct it. The so-called Zhenguan reign was not a time without disasters, miscarriages of justice, or factional struggles, and it certainly did not mean that every ordinary person was prosperous. Its central achievement was more basic. After the collapse of the Sui, the Tang restored order. The central government gradually established relatively stable systems of taxation, household registration, official recruitment, law, and military administration. The Tang legal code was also refined during this period. More importantly, Li Shimin had personally witnessed the fall of the Sui, so he repeatedly held Emperor Yang up as a political warning. The famous idea that water can carry a boat but can also overturn it captured the atmosphere. A ruling elite that had just watched a dynasty collapse was far more sensitive than a peaceful regime to the danger of pushing ordinary people too far. Yet the Great Tang could not remain forever a state focused only on recovery. In the north, the Eastern Turks had once been powerful enough to threaten Chang'an directly. In 626, not long after Li Shimin took the throne, a large Turkic army approached the Wei River, placing the Tang court under enormous pressure. But within a few years, the situation was reversed. In 630, Tang commanders led by Li Jing launched a campaign against the Eastern Turks, and the Kagan Jeli was captured. The Eastern Turkic Khaganate temporarily collapsed. Tang prestige surged across the northern frontier, and Li Shimin gained the kind of title often rendered as Heavenly Khagan in relations with the steppe powers. The Tang Empire was beginning to develop a character very different from that of the Qin and Han empires. Chang'an was not merely the capital of a Chinese agrarian dynasty. It increasingly became a political hub linking the steppe, the western regions, Central Asia, and East Asia. Leaders, merchants, envoys, monks, and musicians from many lands entered the city. The Tang managed its frontiers through a mixture of indirect rule, titles, and investiture, marriage alliances, garrisons, and warfare. It was not a modern nation-state, nor a uniformly administered territorial state with sharply defined borders. It was a complicated imperial order built out of multiple layers of authority and many different kinds of relationships. The roads to the west mattered just as much. Tang armies and diplomats interacted with Tuyuhun, Gaochang, Kucha, and other polities, extending Tang influence deeper into Central Asia. In 641, Princess Wenshang entered Tibet and married Songtsen Gampo, becoming one of the most famous episodes in the history of Tang-Tibetan relations. Later generations often reduce the story to the words marriage alliance. But real frontier relations are never settled by one marriage. Tang China and Tibet experienced long periods of exchange as well as repeated wars. A marriage could create a political buffer. It could not erase geopolitical competition. At the same time, the Tang's ability to absorb outside culture was growing rapidly. Buddhism had already penetrated Chinese society for centuries, and under the Tang, it developed into multiple schools and intellectual traditions. Xuanzang's journey west was perhaps the most legendary cultural episode of the age. He left Chang'an, crossed deserts and oases, reached India, studied Buddhist teachings, and eventually returned with a vast collection of scriptures, organizing translation projects in Chang'an. It is easy today to blend the historical Xuanzang with the Monkey King, Pigzi, and the other figures a journey to the west. But the real Xuanzong had no magical monkey clearing the road for him. He faced long journeys, unfamiliar languages, political borders, and the possibility of death. That makes his journey even more remarkable. An empire's openness is not measured only by foreigners arriving in its capital. It is also measured by whether its own monks and scholars can reach distant worlds and bring knowledge back home. Even in his later years, Taizong did not always maintain the restraint of his early reign. His campaigns against Goguryeo failed to achieve the results he wanted, and the question of succession caused him serious distress. Crown Prince Li Chengxian was removed. Prince Li Tai withdrew from the succession struggle, and eventually the Prince of Jin, Li Ji, was made crown prince. In 649, Li Shimin died, and Li Ji ascended the throne as Emperor Gaozong. In the traditional narrative, Gaozong is often overshadowed by his father, Li Shimin, on one side and his wife, Wu Zetian, on the other. But in fact, the Tang under Gaozong continued to expand during the earlier part of his reign and achieved several major military goals left unfinished during Zhenguan. The Western Turks were badly weakened, and Tang influence in the western regions reached one of its high points. In 668, Goguryeo fell, reshaping the Tang order along the northeastern frontier. At this moment, Tang military strength, territory, and influence were all near a peak. Yet the most consequential political change of Gaozong's reign unfolded inside the palace. A woman who had once served as a concubine of Emperor Taizong was about to return to the center of imperial power. Her name was Wu Zetian. Wu Zetian had entered Taizong's palace in her youth. After his death, she spent time at Ganya Temple as a Buddhist nun before returning to Gaozong's court. She first became a Jiaoi, a high-ranking imperial consort, and then, through a fierce struggle within the palace, defeated Empress Wang and consort Xiao to become empress. Traditional histories contain many shocking stories about how she rose to power, and some of the details have long been disputed. But one thing is clear: this was never simply a palace romance or a domestic feud. The position of empress was tied to the interests of aristocratic families, court officials, imperial relatives, and the emperor himself. Wu Zetian's victory was part of Gaozong's struggle to weaken some older political groups and reshape power at court, but it also reflected her own extraordinary political ability. As Gaozong's health deteriorated, Wu took on more and more responsibility in government. The situation in which emperor and empress were jointly referred to as the two sages showed just how far she had moved beyond the traditional role of a consort. When Gaozong died in 683, his son Li Xian became emperor, but Wu Zetian soon deposed him and replaced him with another son, Li Dan. The real ruler was now Wu Zetian herself. In 690, she went one step further. She formally took the imperial title and changed the name of the dynasty to Zhou. This was one of the most extraordinary episodes in the history of Chinese monarchy. A woman was not merely ruling as Empress Dowager, nor governing from behind a young male sovereign. She openly became emperor. She worked to build a political legitimacy for her rule, used Buddhist symbolism, reshaped the bureaucracy, suppressed opponents, and expanded the pool of talent through examinations and recommendation. Her reign left a dark legacy of secret denunciations, political purges, and ruthless officials, but also promoted new political elites. She was not simply a female tyrant, nor is she easily repackaged as a modern inspirational heroine. She was a ruler who seized supreme power in an extraordinarily difficult political and gender environment, and the method she used could be just as ruthless as those employed by many male emperors. During the Zhou interregnum under Wu Zetian, the Li imperial clan did not disappear. Opposition remained, and the balance among the Wu family, the Li imperial house, and the bureaucracy grew increasingly complicated. In Wu Zetian's final years, the question of succession became the most dangerous issue of all. Should the throne pass to her nephews from the Wu family, or be returned to her own sons? If the Wu family inherited the throne, the dynasty would truly change its surname. If her son inherited it, the Tang would be restored. In the end, Li Xian was named crown prince again. In 705, when Wu Zetian fell seriously ill, Zhang Jianji and other officials launched the Shunlong coup, forcing her to abdicate. Emperor Zhongzong was restored, and the dynasty once again took the name Tang. Many people imagine that once Wu Zetian stepped aside, the Great Tang immediately returned to normal. The opposite was true. The next several years were among the most turbulent palace politics of the entire dynasty. Empress Wei, her daughter Princess Anil, Princess Taiping, and Li Longji all competed for influence. In 710, Zhongzong suddenly died, and Empress Wei tried to seize control. Li Longji, the Prince of Linzi, joined forces with Princess Taiping, carried out a coup, destroyed Wei's faction, and restored Li Dan to the throne. He became Emperor Ruizong for a second time. But once their common enemy was gone, the conflict between Li Longji and Princess Taiping became increasingly bitter. Even after Ruizong yielded the throne to Li Longji, power was not fully settled. In 713, Li Longji struck first and eliminated Princess Taiping's faction. From that point on, he truly controlled the empire. This young emperor would eventually push the Tang to the height of its power, and then live long enough to watch that golden age collapse. He was Emperor Xuanzong. The Li Longji of the early Kaiyuan era almost seems like a different man from the Li Longji of the late Tianbao era. In his youth, Xuanzong was energetic, disciplined the bureaucracy, reduced redundant officials, paid close attention to state finances, and appointed capable chancellors such as Yao Chong and Song Jing. He understood that decades of palace coups had weakened the political order and that imperial authority and the bureaucracy had to be rebuilt. He also limited excessive interference by imperial relatives, in-laws, and favored palace insiders. During Kaiyuan, society stabilized, the population grew, agriculture and handicrafts expanded, transportation networks became more active, Chang'an and Luoyang flourished, and the economic importance of the Jiangnan region continued to rise. Chang'an at this time is perhaps the best window into understanding the Tang. Imagine entering through one of its gates. You would not be stepping into a city of a single culture. In a markets were merchants from Sogdia, Persia, Central Asia, and beyond, people wearing unfamiliar clothes and foods and goods such as flatbreads, wine, spices, and precious stones. Musical instruments and dances introduced from the Western regions had become fashionable. Buddhist temples, Taoist monasteries, and sites associated with other foreign religions existed alongside one another. Envoys and students from Japan and Silla came to the Tang to study its institutions and culture. This openness is exactly what later exhibitions on the Tang have emphasized. Chang'an was not only China's political and cultural center, but also one of the most important international cities of the world at the time. But if you had actually lived in the Tang, a golden age would not have meant endless banquets, wine, and poetry. Most people were still farmers dealing with taxes, labor service, climate, disease, and local officials. Travel was nothing like it is today, and an ordinary person might never see Chang'an in an entire lifetime. The Tang poems, Sankai ceramics, gold and silver objects, murals, music and dance that survive today are brilliant snapshots of a complex society, not a picture of everyday life for everyone. Yet precisely because population, production, and commerce had recovered, urban culture, consumption, and the movement of knowledge were able to flourish on a scale that had rarely been seen before. The civil service examinations also grew increasingly important during the Tang. They had not yet displaced hereditary privilege completely. Great aristocratic families still wielded enormous influence. But examinations offered a new path upward. The Jinshi degree, in particular, gradually became exceptionally prestigious. The flourishing of Tang poetry cannot, of course, be explained by the examinations alone. Yet the political careers, social networks, and literary lives of educated men were deeply intertwined, making poetry one of the defining forms of expression of the age. Wang Wei painted landscapes while serving at court. Gao Shi and Xin Shun wrote frontier poetry, while actually living in the world of imperial military expansion. Li Bai came to Chang'an with intense political ambitions, not merely to become a romantic poet. And Du Fu would later use his own wandering life to write the shock of the empire's transition from prosperity to civil war into the fate of ordinary people. The brighter the light of the Yuan Golden Age became, the more dangerous the question was, why would an empire that looked organized, wealthy, and culturally vibrant be shattered by the Lushan rebellion only a few decades later? The answer was not one corrupt minister, nor one beautiful woman. It lay in structural changes that had already taken place inside the Golden Age itself. One of the foundations of the early Tang military system was the phubbing, or militia system. In simple terms, the state maintained soldiers within the system of household registration and land allocation and called them up when military service was needed. But as the empire expanded, warfare became more specialized, and frontier pressure lasted for longer periods. The system became harder and harder to sustain. The borders could no longer be defended by temporary conscripts alone. Permanent, professional frontier armies became increasingly important. This was the environment in which the Jidushi, or military governors, expanded. The central government handed large areas of frontier military and administrative authority to powerful commanders. In the short term, this improved efficiency. In the long term, it meant that frontier commanders controlled troops, money, and local networks. If central power weakened, they could become semi-independent centers of power. Xuanzong was still able to control this system during the first part of his reign. But by the Tianbao era, the political style at court had changed significantly. Li Linfu served as chief minister for many years. He was skilled at preserving imperial authority and destroying rivals, but he also suppressed potential competitors. Then Yang Guozhong rose. The most famous figure in the palace, meanwhile, was Yang Guifei. Later literature transformed the relationship between Xuanzong and Yang Guifei into one of China's great tragic romances. But the political crisis was never simply about an emperor becoming infatuated with a beautiful woman. The rise of the Yang family, rivalries among ministers, the concentration of military power on the frontiers, and changes in the emperor's style of governance in his later years all piled on top of one another. Among the frontier commanders, one name became increasingly important, and Li Shimin. He came from the ethnically diverse frontier world, became skilled at cultivating his relationship with the emperor and the court, and eventually held the major military commands of Fanyang, Pinglu, and Hudong, giving him enormous military power. Why could someone like this accumulate so much authority? Because the empire believed that powerful frontier commanders could defend its vast borders while the central government remained capable of controlling them. For a long time, that assumption was not entirely wrong. The fatal weakness came when the chain of trust linking the emperor, his ministers, and his frontier commanders broke. The military power stored inside the system could suddenly turn against the system itself. As the conflict between Li Shimin and Yang Guozhong deepened, Li Shimin launched a rebellion from Fanyang in 755, claiming that he was marching to remove Yang Guozhong from power. The Li Shimin rebellion had begun. The rebels advanced with astonishing speed. Much of Hebei and Hunan was quickly consumed by war. Luoyang fell, and Li Shimin declared himself emperor. Tang armies organized a defensive line at Tong Pass. Generals such as Gao Xianji and Feng Changqing had tried to stabilize the situation, but political suspicion led to their execution. Later, Geshu Han took command at Tong Pass and faced an extremely dangerous situation. From a military standpoint, holding the pass and delaying the rebels might have been a wiser strategy. But the court demanded an attack. Geshu Han was forced to leave the pass, and the Tang army was crushed. Once Tong Pass fell, the road to Chang'an lay open. In 756, Emperor Xuanzong fled west in panic. The Chang'an that had once drawn officials and envoys from across the world now stood in the path of the advancing rebels. At Maowei Station, the soldiers accompanying the emperor mutinied. They blamed Yang Guozhong for the disaster, killed him, and then demanded Yang Guifei's death. Xuanzong was ultimately forced to order her execution. Later literature turned the episode into a scene of immense tragic beauty. Politically, however, the most frightening fact about Maowei was that the highest authority in the empire had lost absolute control over the troops supposedly protecting him. The emperor was still the emperor, but he had to accept conditions imposed by mutinous soldiers. Xuanzong continued fleeing toward Shu, while his son and crown Prince Li Heng did not remain with him. At Lingwu, Li Heng proclaimed himself emperor and became Emperor Suzong. The Tang now faced a strange situation. The old emperor was still alive, but a new emperor had already taken the throne. Suzong had to organize a counteroffensive quickly, or both his own legitimacy and the dynasty itself could collapse. The Tang court mobilized armies from the northwest and sought military assistance from the Uyghurs. Commanders such as Guizi and Li Guangbi became crucial to the campaign. In 757, Tang forces recaptured Chang'an and Luoyang. But the war was far from over, and Li Shimin had already been killed by his own son, and Qingxiu, and the rebel camp was repeatedly torn apart by internal coups. Shi Siming later launched another offensive, only to be killed by his own son, Shi Chaoyi. The rebel movement was like a wounded but still enormous beast, tearing itself apart even as it continued fighting the Tang. Only in 763, when Shi Chaoyi committed suicide, did the Li Shimin rebellion finally come to an end. 8 years of war had transformed the Tang Dynasty. Look only at the map, and you might think the Tang was still intact. The emperor's surname was still Li. Chang'an had returned to imperial control, and the bureaucracy was still functioning. But the real transformation had happened in the bones of the empire. To put down the rebellion, the court had to depend on regional military commands and accept that some former rebel commanders would continue to control military and administrative power in places such as Hebei. The problem of the Jadushi had therefore changed from a frontier military arrangement into a long-term struggle between center and locality. Not every regional command became permanently independent, and not every military governor was hostile to the central government. But the court could no longer mobilize the empire's military resources as easily as it had during the early Tang. The financial system changed just as fundamentally. War, population movement, and the destruction of household registers made the old Ziyangdiao system, which depended heavily on land and registered households, increasingly difficult to maintain. The state needed a new way to raise revenue. In the Middle Tang, the two-tax system was introduced with taxation based more on property and actual residence and collected twice a year, in summer and autumn. It reflected a broader shift away from the old system of controlling households through labor and head taxes toward more realistic forms of property and local taxation. Behind the reform lay a simple fact. The social and economic conditions that had supported the High Tang no longer existed. The symbolic transformation of Chang'an and Luoyang was even more disturbing. The two capitals, once extraordinarily prosperous, were repeatedly damaged by war. Du Fu witnessed much of this himself. In his poems, spring still came to Chang'an and the plants still grew, but the city itself seemed shattered by war. These poems matter not just because they are beautiful, but because the personal experience of one writer overlaps with the fracture of an empire. The Golden Age did not end as an abstract political label. It ended in flight, hunger, conscription, broken families, and ruined cities. And yet the Tang did not immediately move toward extinction after 763. In fact, it survived for another 140 years or so. To understand the dynasty, we have to take those years seriously. Otherwise, it is easy to reduce everything after the Lushan rebellion to a single phrase: warlordism and eunuch domination. The reality of the Middle and Late Tang was far more complicated. The first emperors to face the aftermath were Suzong and Emperor Taizong. During the war, Suzong relied on eunuchs, such as Li Fugua, allowing eunuch influence to penetrate even deeper into the military and political core of the state. By the time Xuanzong returned to Chang'an late in his life, he had effectively lost political control. Xuanzong and Suzong died within a short period of one another in 762, and Taizong, Liu, became emperor. The Tang now faced more than the remnants of the rebellion. Tibet expanded rapidly while the Tang was in turmoil, devastating the northwestern defense system. In 763, Tibetan forces even entered Chang'an for a time, forcing Taizong to flee. Although the Tibetans soon withdrew, the symbolism was enormous. An empire that had once pushed westward and controlled routes into the western regions could now see its own capital breached by a frontier power. Large parts of the Hushi and Longyu regions gradually slipped from Tang control, badly weakening the empire's overland connections with Central Asia. In the frontier poems of the High Tang, young men in Chang'an could imagine riding beyond the frontier, winning glory, and earning titles. By the Middle Tang, the Northwest Front had become more like a wound that never stopped bleeding. The empire did not suddenly shrink into a small state, but its strategic environment had been fundamentally transformed. The internal situation was just as difficult. Some Hebei military commands still acknowledged the central government in name, but increasingly behaved as hereditary domains. When a military governor died, his subordinates or family often wanted to choose the successor themselves and only afterwards seek official recognition from the court. For the central government, direct military intervention was enormously expensive. Refusing to intervene, however, meant accepting that local powers were becoming more autonomous. Late Tang politics therefore produced a strange pattern. Emperors, ministers, and regional commanders all knew that none of the others could be fully trusted, but none could easily overturn the whole table. The center needed local armies to preserve order, while local commanders needed imperial titles and legitimacy. Warlord fragmentation was often less a neat division into independent states than a constantly changing negotiation over power. During Taizong's reign, one of the most important financial administrators was Li Yuan. He reorganized the salt administration, grain transport, and state finances in an effort to give the battered empire a more stable income. Why was salt so important? Because almost everyone needed it. If the state could control its production or distribution, it could obtain a more dependable revenue stream than the old head taxes. After the Lushan rebellion, military spending was enormous and the old household system was in ruins. Salt revenues gradually became a lifeline for the central treasury. As taxation shifted more and more from land and register households toward commercial circulation, society itself was changing. In 779, Emperor Taizong took the throne. He had lived through the Lushan rebellion as a young man and deeply resented the arrogance of the military governors. He began his reign with ambitious plans to weaken regional powers and restore central authority. The goal sounded perfectly reasonable. In practice, it was extraordinarily dangerous. These regional commands were not mere administrative units on paper. Behind them stood armies, interests, and local networks built over decades. If the court pressured several powerful governors at the same time, rival commanders who had previously competed with one another could easily be pushed into the same coalition. In 781, tensions between the court and the Hebei commands exploded over the issue of succession. Taizong tried to use the crisis to curb the regional governors, and the conflict rapidly expanded into war. At first, the court appeared to possess both the institutional and moral advantage. But as the front lines stretched out and military costs soared, the central armies themselves became unstable. In 783, troops from Zhenguan were sent toward the front. When they passed through Chang'an, they mutinied over pay and provisions and marched straight into the capital. Taizong fled in panic to Fengtian. The rebels enthroned Zhu Xi as emperor, and Chang'an once again fell into turmoil. It was almost an enlarged version of what had happened at Maui. The most dangerous enemy of the empire did not always have to come from a distant frontier. It could also be the army the emperor himself had mobilized. Taizong was forced to issue a self-accusatory edict, admit that his policies had failed, and pardon some of the regional commanders. Only after generals, such as Li Sheng, recaptured Chang'an did the crisis begin to ease. Taizong's personality and political style changed after this. He was no longer willing to rely on the confidence in civilian officials and open institutions that had marked the beginning of his reign. Instead, he increasingly depended on the eunuch-controlled Shen's army and the palace treasury. To defend the throne against the military governors, the emperor had to strengthen a central guard commanded by eunuchs. The eunuchs gained more military power. The emperor then found it even harder to escape their influence. This became one of the most stubborn power traps of the late Tang. The two-tax system was also formally implemented during Taizong's reign. Chancellor Yang Yan led the reform, replacing the old and increasingly unwieldy Xiangdiao system with a new structure centered on two annual tax collections in summer and autumn. It was not a perfectly fair tax system in a modern sense, but it fit the realities of a post-Lushan society marked by migration, land concentration, and the weakening of old household registration controls. The Tang's ability to survive for another century after such devastation had a great deal to do with this financial restructuring. A state close to collapse does not necessarily die because it has problems. It dies when it loses the ability to adapt. The Middle Tang still had that ability. Culture did not disappear with the High Tang either. In fact, after the upheavals, literature developed a different tone. Bai Ji deliberately wrote in language that ordinary people could understand, and he wrote about coal cellars, palace women, war, and the lives of common people. Han Yu promoted the classical prose movement, seeking to transform literary style and rethink the Confucian tradition. Lu Zongyuan wrote landscape poetry and philosophical prose through political failure and exile. High Tang literature often feels like a confident person standing on a hill and looking out over the world. Middle Tang literature feels more like someone who has suffered a serious wound and has begun to ask, what exactly has gone wrong with society? After Taizong, Xuanzong ruled only briefly. He was already in poor health when he ascended the throne, but a reform movement gathered around figures such as Wang Shuwen. They tried to curb the eunuchs and reform government finance and administration in what became known as the Yongzhen Reform. The attempt failed quickly. Wang Shuwen's group was purged, and writers such as Lu Zongyuan and Lu Yushi were exiled. Once again, we see a recurring pattern in late Tang politics. Many emperors and scholars understood that eunuchs and military governors were serious problems, and many repeatedly tried to solve them. But by then, changing a few people was no longer enough. The entire structure of power had become locked together. In 805, Li Chun became Emperor Xinzong. His reign saw the most important revival of central authority in the later Tang, remembered as the Yuan Restoration. Xinzong did not make the mistake of attacking every regional power at once. Instead, he exploited the differences among the military governors and dealt with them selectively. With ministers such as Pei Du, the court eventually won a crucial victory in the war against Wu Yuanji of Huaishi. General Li Su's surprise attack on Kai Prefecture on a snowy night became one of the most legendary operations in Chinese military history. It was a bitterly cold night. Li Su led his troops through the snow and deep into enemy territory with startling speed. The heavy snowfall concealed their movement and made the defenders relax their vigilance. The Tang army marched for hours, and many soldiers reportedly did not even know their ultimate destination until they were close to Kai Prefecture. Once the city fell, Wu Yuanji was captured, The pacification of Huaishi shook the political world, and several military commands that had previously acted arrogantly began once again to submit to the court. For a brief moment, the Tang seemed to have a real chance of returning to stronger central control. But the very name Yuan restoration reminds us of its limits. It was a restoration, not a return to Yuan. The military commands were not destroyed. They had simply accepted central restraint again for a time. More dangerous still, eunuch power inside the palace remained strong. In 820, Emperor Taizong died suddenly, and traditional sources often connect his death to the eunuchs. After that, eunuchs exerted an increasingly direct influence over which emperors lived, died, or were replaced. The emperor was supposed to be the highest point in the power structure. Yet in the late Tang, some emperors discovered that the men guarding their chambers, controlling the palace gates, and commanding the imperial guard might have more power over life and death than the chancellors outside. Under the next emperors, Muzong, Jingzong, and Wenzong, the central government remained trapped in the same crisis. Jingzong was murdered in 827 by eunuchs and palace attendants. When Wenzong, Li Yuan, came to the throne, he deeply hated eunuch domination. He did not merely dream of striking back. He actually planned an operation that could have changed the entire history of the late Tang. In 835, the Xuanwu Incident erupted. Wenzong, Li Sun, Zhang Zhu, and others plotted to destroy the powerful eunuchs. The basic plan was to stage a supposed miracle, a report that sweet dew had appeared, to lure the leading eunuchs to inspect it, then have hidden soldiers attack them. But something went wrong. The eunuchs sensed the trap, seized control of the emperor, and mobilized the Shen's army. A massive purge followed. The planners were killed, along with large numbers of officials, and the court was drenched in blood. What makes the Xuanwu incident so disturbing is not only that the coup failed. The emperor himself was effectively held hostage by the eunuchs. Emperor Wenzong later lamented that his situation was worse than that of weak rulers, such as the Zhou King Nan or the Han Emperor Xian. Those men had been controlled by powerful ministers outside the palace. He, by contrast, was controlled by servants of the imperial household. Whatever the exact form in which the remark was transmitted, it captured the late Tang dilemma perfectly. The emperor was theoretically supreme, yet the security of his own palace depended on the very men he most wanted to eliminate. But Tang history never followed a simple downward line. In 840, Emperor Wuzong came to the throne. With Li Diyu as a major political ally, central government briefly regained some strength, and the dynasty achieved several military successes abroad. Wuzong's most famous and most controversial policy was the Huichong persecution of Buddhism. By the Tang, Buddhism had spent more than 2 centuries building up an enormous network of temples, landholdings, monks, nuns, and economic resources. For the state, religion was not only a matter of belief. It also affected taxes, labor, and control of land. Wuzong personally favored Taoism and faced real fiscal pressures. He therefore ordered large numbers of temples destroyed and monks and nuns forced to return to lay life. Buddhism suffered a major setback, and other foreign religions were also affected. The episode is a reminder that the Tang's reputation for openness and tolerance was never a permanent, unchanging policy. Openness had its peaks, and it could contract when political, financial, and intellectual conditions changed. After Wuzong's death, Emperor Xuanzong took the throne. Later generations often called him the Little Taizong. He tried to reform official administration and restrain eunuchs and military governors, and for a time the political situation was relatively stable. Even more striking was the resurgence of Tang authority in the Heshi region, where Zhang Yichao rose against Tibetan rule, recovered places such as Shazhou, and sent envoys back to the Tang court. For a dynasty that had lost Heshi decades earlier, it was as if a vital artery in the northwest had suddenly reopened. Zhang Yichao eventually brought parts of the region back under nominal Tang rule, showing that even in the middle of the 9th century, the dynasty's political appeal had not completely disappeared. But by then the state had entered a phase that was increasingly difficult to reverse. The central treasury was under heavy pressure, local power was complicated, eunuch influence was deeply rooted, and political factions had been fighting one another for generations. The phrase, "Nyoli factional struggle," is commonly used to describe the conflict between men such as Niu Sengru and Li Zongmin on one side, and Li Diyu and his allies on the other. Older accounts often reduced it to a simple battle between two groups divided by examination background and family status. Modern scholarship points to a much more complicated picture involving policy choices, personal networks, imperial preferences, and long-standing grudges. Whatever the precise causes, the result was the same. Senior officials were constantly promoted and exiled in cycles, while enormous political energy was consumed by internal competition. The deeper problem was rooted in the lower levels of the empire. Commercial activity and urban life remained vigorous in the late Tang, and the Jiangnan region became increasingly wealthy. Cities such as Yangzhou could be astonishingly prosperous, but wealth was distributed very unevenly. Salt taxes and other revenues gave the court money, while monopoly controls and high prices could also shift the burden onto ordinary people. Local officials, military commands, powerful families, merchants, and the central treasury all extracted their share at different points. For an ordinary family, the brilliance of Tang poetry could not erase hunger and heavy burdens. In the middle and later 9th century, disasters, financial pressure, and social tensions accumulated. Under Emperor Taizong, the court repeatedly launched costly military campaigns, while contemporary historians also criticized the extravagance of the palace. The Tang fought several major wars with Nanzhao in the southwest, draining enormous resources. By the time Emperor Taizong came to the throne, the storm capable of destroying the late Tang order was already approaching. That storm did not begin in the palace at Chang'an. It spread outward from salt smugglers and mobile armed bands. Around 874, Wang Xinji launched a rebellion, and Huang Chao soon became one of its most important leaders. Huang Chao was said to have come from a salt merchant family, and later stories claim that he had failed the civil service examinations, though many of these colorful details are difficult to verify. What can be said with confidence is that the rebellion was deeply connected to the economic structure of the late Tang. Smuggling salt already required people to organize regional networks outside the state's monopoly system. Such men knew roads, transport routes, and local society. Once they turned to armed revolt, their ability to mobilize was far greater than that of ordinary peasants suddenly gathering in protest. Wang Xinji and Huang Chao kept their armies on the move. They did not begin by establishing one fixed base. Instead, They crossed multiple regions like a rapidly moving storm. Government forces were exhausted by the pursuit, and local order was repeatedly torn apart. After Wang Xinji died, Huang Chao became the dominant leader. His forces moved south, reached Lingnan, captured Guangzhou, and later turned north again. In 880, Huang Chao's army entered Luoyang and then advanced toward Tong Pass. The Tang defensive lines collapsed. In 881, Emperor Taizong fled to Chengdu, while Huang Chao entered Chang'an and established a new regime known as Great Qi. More than 2 centuries earlier, Li Yuan had seized Chang'an and founded the Tang. A century earlier, An Lushan's rebels had entered the same city. Now a massive popular rebellion had occupied the capital of the empire once again. Chang'an was still there. The walls were still there. The palaces were still there. But Tang control over the city had been broken again and again. Huang Chao's capture of the capital did not automatically give him stable rule. He faced enormous problems of food supply, military discipline, local administration, and bureaucratic governance. Capturing an imperial capital and governing an empire were 2 completely different things. The Tang reorganized its counterattack. More importantly, Shadowall military forces began moving into the political center of China. One of their most important leaders was Li Qiang. At the same time, Huang Chao's own camp began to change. A man who would eventually destroy the Tang Dynasty was at this moment still serving as one of Huang Chao's generals. His name was Zhenguan. In 882, Zhenguan surrendered to the Tang. The court gave him the name Zhu Chuanzhong, meaning completely loyal. The irony is hard to miss. The court seemed to hope that he would now be utterly faithful to the dynasty. History would prove that the late Tang central government no longer had the power to make such loyalty last. In 883, Huang Chao's army withdrew from Chang'an. The following year, Huang Chao was defeated and died, bringing the Great Rebellion largely to an end. On the surface, the Tang had survived yet again. But this time the situation was different from the aftermath of the An Lushan rebellion. After An Lushan, the Tang still had enough capacity to rebuild its finances and central institutions. After Huang Chao, the social foundations of the central government, its control over the provinces, and its military authority had suffered a much deeper collapse. The warlords who had risen to suppress the rebellion had become the empire's new practical rulers. Li Qiang controlled Hedong, Zhu Chuanzhong controlled the Xuanwu region, and powerful military governors emerged elsewhere as well. When Emperor Taizong returned to Chang'an, the emperor had become almost like a banner being carried among competing armies. Whoever controlled the emperor could issue edicts, grant offices, and attack rivals in the name of the court. Late Tang politics entered an especially brutal phase. The warlords still needed the legitimacy of Great Tang, but at the same time they were steadily hollowing it out. In 888, Shizong died and Li Yi became Emperor Zhaozong. Zhaozong had no intention of being a puppet. He tried to rebuild imperial authority, reorganize the palace guards, and escape the control of the eunuchs and regional military governors. In terms of personal determination, he may have wanted to restore the Tang more than many of his predecessors. The problem was that by this point the emperor lacked not determination but resources. Warlords surrounded Chang'an. Li Qiang held Hedong, Zhu Chuanzhong dominated the east, and Li Maozhen controlled Fengxiang. Eunuchs still commanded forces inside the palace. Zhaozong was repeatedly controlled, forced to flee and brought back among these competing powers. Court edicts often depended on the support of one warlord or another. The machinery of the Tang state still spoke, but the power behind its voice belonged to someone else. Around 900, the eunuchs even staged a coup, deposed Zhaozong, and later restored him when the political situation shifted. Zhu Qianzhong used the opportunity to intervene more deeply in central government. In 903, under his pressure, the powerful eunuch faction was subjected to a massive purge. It seemed that the eunuch problem that had haunted the Tang for more than a century had finally been solved, but was not solved by an independent imperial government. It was solved by a stronger warlord. One set of chains had been broken, only for the emperor to fall into another man's hands. Zhu Qianzhong then forced Zhaozong to move the capital to Luoyang. Chang'an, the city that had symbolized the Li Tang Empire since 618, was heavily damaged. Palaces and homes were demolished, and much of the population was relocated. For the Tang, this was a symbol almost deeper than the deposition of an emperor. The dynasty was being torn out by the roots from its political homeland. In 904, Zhu Qianzhong had Emperor Zhaozong killed. The young Li Zhu was then placed on the throne as Emperor Ai. Everyone understood that the boy was only the final formality. In 907, Zhu Qianzhong forced Emperor Ai to abdicate and founded the later Li Yuan. The Tang Dynasty was over. From Li Yuan's accession in 618 to Zhu Qianzhong's overthrow of the Tang in 907, the dynasty lasted almost 3 centuries. Wu Zetian briefly changed the dynastic name to Zhou, interrupting the Li line, but in the larger historical sense, we still speak of this entire era as the Tang. It rose from the ruins of the late Sui, survived the wars of unification and the bloodshed of Xuanwu Gate, and rebuilt order during Zhenguan. Under Gaozong, it expanded. Wu Zetian reshaped political life as the first and only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor in her own name. Xuanzong pushed the empire into the Kaiyuan Golden Age, only to witness the dangerous accumulation of structural weaknesses during Tianbao. The Lushan rebellion split the Hai Tang in two, but did not immediately kill the dynasty. The Middle Tang survived through fiscal reform, military reorganization, and political adaptation, even producing the Yuan restoration. In the late Tang, however, regional commanders, eunuchs, factional politics, financial pressure, and popular rebellion gradually stripped the court of effective control over armies and provinces. In the end, the dynasty was replaced by the warlord Zhenguan, who had risen to power in the very wars fought to save it. If we press the political story one layer closer to everyday life, we also understand why the Tang feels so intensely present to later generations. It left behind an unusually rich archive. Epitaphs tell us the counties and prefectures through which officials traveled in their lifetimes. Dunhuang manuscripts preserve contracts, accounts, loans, and government documents. 2 murals show banquets, travel, hunting, and attendance. Poems record weather, inns, postal roads, illness, prices, and separation. The Tang is therefore not just a list of emperors. It contains thousands of voices from ordinary life. A young man preparing for the civil service examinations might leave his home region and travel along post roads and waterways toward Chang'an. He had to find money for the journey, submit essays, and build connections with influential people, and face the uncertainty of the examinations. Passing the Jinshu examination did not mean instant success. He still had to go through official selection procedures. But once someone passed, his social prestige could rise dramatically, which is why Chang'an came alive with stories whenever the examination results were released. Some candidates became famous overnight. Others failed year after year. Literature, therefore, served not only as a display of talent, but also as a tool of political and social networking. A boatman carrying grain north from Jiangnan would never have described his own life as the shift of China's economic center toward the south. He knew only whether the waterways were open, whether his force service was too heavy, and whether his cargo would reach its destination on time. Yet hundreds of thousands of people like him carried the wealth of the southeast into Luoyang and Chang'an. Whenever the canal system was disrupted in the Middle and Late Tang, the court immediately became anxious because grain prices in the capital could be affected directly. A frontier soldier would not have thought of himself as an example of the recruitment system replacing the old militia system. After years of garrison duty, he might move his family near the military settlement and become deeply tied to the local community. If his commander provided food, rewards, and practical support for his family, his loyalty to the military governor could become stronger than his abstract loyalty to an emperor hundreds of miles away in Chang'an. The gradual privatization of military commands was therefore not some mysterious change visible only on an institutional chart. It grew from countless concrete interests accumulating over many years. The rise of eunuchs also cannot be explained simply by personality. The emperor lived deep inside the palace, while ministers from the outer court could not always enter freely. Information had to pass through palace personnel. Eunuchs accompanied the emperor in his daily life, carried out secret orders, and eventually controlled palace gates and imperial guards. That gave them a natural advantage in information and access. An emperor worried about ministers forming factions could become even more dependent on eunuchs, who did not have conventional hereditary family structures of their own. Once eunuchs gained power, they built networks of adopted sons, clients, and vested interests. A tool originally meant to balance the outer court eventually became another powerful group that had to be controlled. The emperors of the Tang were not simply a sequence of temple names. Gaozu, Li Yuan, had lived through the political worlds of northern Zhou, Sui, and Tang, and carried with him the deep imprint of the Guanlong aristocratic order. Taizong, Li Shimin, was a ruler who had conquered through war and therefore understood military power and human loyalty exceptionally well. Gaozong, Li Ji, was long overshadowed by Wu Zetian, yet his reign saw the empire reach one of its greatest territorial peaks. Zhongzong and Ruizong repeatedly entered and left the throne under the immense shadow of their mother Wu Zetian and the struggles within the imperial family. Xuanzong, meanwhile, stamped both energetic reform and late-life loss of control into history through the astonishing contrast between the two halves of his own reign. After the Lushan Rebellion, the position of the emperor changed dramatically. Suzong was an emperor who took the throne in wartime and had to rebuild the state through military power. Daizong faced Tibetan forces entering Chang'an and the realities of the regional commands. After the Zhenguan mutiny, Dizong shifted from aggressive attempts to curb the military governors toward cautious self-preservation. Xuanzong had only a brief opportunity to rule. Xuanzong again demonstrated the power of the central government against the regional commanders. Muzong failed to preserve much of his father's achievement. Jingzong was young and indulgent, and eventually died at the hands of people around him. Wenzong tried to destroy the eunuchs and failed. Wuzong briefly strengthened imperial authority and persecuted Buddhism. Xuanzong worked to restore order. Under Yizong and Shizong, the national crisis widened. Zhaozong was like a late reformer who understood the disease clearly, but no longer possessed the tools to cure it. The decades after Emperor Xuanzong are often rushed through in popular narratives, but they explain a great deal about why the late Tang collapsed. After Xuanzong died, Yizong became emperor. The political situation in southern and southwestern China grew increasingly complicated. Nanzhao forces clashed repeatedly with the Tang, and the court had to keep raising troops and money. Massive military expenditure, palace spending, and local problems put the treasury under increasing pressure. The Tang did not suddenly become poor. Instead, its revenue became increasingly dependent on a small number of sources, while its expenditures became increasingly rigid. The salt monopoly is a perfect example. The state needed salt revenue to fund the army. The tighter the price controls and monopoly became, the greater the profits from smuggling. The larger the smuggling networks grew, the harder the state had to suppress them. And the harder it suppressed them, the more likely some of those people were to turn to armed resistance. The connection between Huang Chao, Wang Xinji, and the salt smuggling world gave late Tang rebellions a different organizational character from simple outbreaks of starving peasants. They possessed the ability to move across regions and understood how markets worked. Local society was changing at the same time as powerful families expanded. During periods of war, ordinary farmers seeking protection might attach themselves to large landowners or local armed groups. Mass flight further distorted the central household registers. Someone whose names still appear on the books might have moved years earlier. A region might actually contain far more people and land than the tax records showed. To a financial official in Chang'an, the empire was a set of numbers. To a regional military governor, it was how much grain, how many soldiers, and how many towns he could actually control. That is why the central government of the late Tang increasingly lost the advantage. The center possessed legitimacy, but often lacked the ability to enforce it. The local powers possessed enforcement capacity, but still needed legitimacy. The two sides exploited each other until a regional strongman became powerful enough that he no longer needed the old legitimacy. At that point, the dynasty itself could finally end. Tang commercial prosperity also produced new groups of wealthy people. Great merchants, salt traders, and participants in overseas commerce could possess enormous fortunes, yet their political status did not necessarily match their wealth. Yangzhou appears repeatedly in poetry not simply because it was beautiful, but because it linked the canal system, the Yangtze, and the salt trade, concentrating merchants, officials, and educated men. Many late Tang poets celebrated Yangzhou's prosperity, creating a striking contrast. Imperial politics were becoming increasingly unstable, yet the lights of some cities still burned brightly at night. This coexistence of local prosperity and overall crisis is crucial. Declining eras rarely feel like the end of the world every single day. Restaurants stay open. Weddings still happen. Merchant ships still sail. Examinations are still held. An ordinary person did not wake up one morning in 850 and suddenly realize, I am living in the late Tang. Instead, people gradually felt that taxes were heavier, armies were more numerous, roads were more dangerous, and officials changed more often. Dynastic decline is often a trend visible in statistics. For an individual, it arrives as one small practical problem after another. The same is true of golden ages. Not everyone lived happily every day during the Yuan era. Poverty, famine, and official corruption still existed. Good historical analysis must avoid treating a golden age as paradise in a time of disorder, as a landscape of ruins at all hours. One of the most fascinating things about the Tang is precisely that prosperity and suffering often existed side by side. Tang poetry gives us an extraordinary record of that complexity. Li Bai wrote of heroic journeys and political frustration. Du Fu wrote about the empire as well as his wife, children, and hunger. Bai Juyi could write about elegant romance and also about coal cellars and war. The lives of Yuan Zhen, Lu Yuxi, and Lu Zhenguan were deeply shaped by the politics of exile and demotion. By the time of Li Shimin and Du Mu, nostalgic poems about the past have become common. Why did late Tang writers love looking back? Because when you stand inside a political crisis and look at the Qin, Han, Six Dynasties, and High Tang, rise and fall stops being abstract knowledge. It becomes a mirror. The word Chang'an also changed meaning in poetry. During the High Tang, it was a center of opportunity. Talented young men wanted to go there, foreign envoys wanted to go there, and the resources of the realm converged there. After the Lushan Rebellion, Chang'an became a symbol of both capture and recovery. In the late Tang, it still contained palaces and government offices, but it was increasingly fragile. The changing meaning of the city reflected a changing state of mind. Another lasting Tang contribution came from printing and the circulation of knowledge. Woodblock printing had already developed during the Tang, and the famous diamond suture printing from Dunhuang can be dated precisely to the late Tang. Printing was not invented all at once on a single day. It matured through long practical experience. As the cost of reproducing text gradually fell, it laid important foundations for the much larger scale spread of knowledge onto the Song. A dynasty approaching its own end was still helping to create the information technologies of the society that would follow. Science and knowledge in medicine, astronomy, calendrical calculation, and geography also continued to accumulate. Sun Simiao lived across the Sui-Tang transition, and his medical works had a lasting influence. The monk Yixing contributed to astronomy and calendar reform, reflecting how seriously the Tang state took the accuracy of its calendar. For an emperor, setting the calendar had practical importance, but it also carried the political symbolism of ruling with heaven's mandate. In pre-modern China, science and politics were never completely separate. The translation of Buddhist texts was an enormous intellectual enterprise. After Xuanzang returned, he organized a translation bureau in Chang'an that required people skilled in Sanskrit, Chinese, Buddhist philosophy, and textual criticism to work together. Translation was not a single scholar sitting alone and replacing one word with another. It was a collective process of debating concepts, meanings, and ways of expression. Many Buddhist terms still used in Chinese today are the result of centuries of translation work. Tang cities were therefore also major centers for processing and producing knowledge. The Tang's maritime connections with the outside world were just as important. Foreign merchants operated in ports such as Guangzhou and Yangzhou, while sea routes linked Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean, and West Asia. The overland Silk Road was repeatedly disrupted by war and changing frontier conditions, making maritime transportation increasingly important. The great maritime trade of the Song and Yuan did not appear from nowhere. It expanded from foundations that already existed under the Tang. The relationship between the Tang and Tibet also needs to be freed from the simple story that after Princess Wencheng married the Tibetan ruler, relations were friendly. The marriage under Sonsen Gampo was certainly an important moment of exchange, but afterward the two powers repeatedly fought over strategic regions in Qinghai, the western regions, and Heshi. After the Lushan Rebellion, Tang frontier troops were pulled back into the interior, allowing Tibet to seize much of Heshi and Longyou and even enter Chang'an. Around 821 to 822, Tang and Tibetan representatives concluded another major treaty. The Tang-Tibet alliance stele in front of the Jiaqing Temple in Lhasa remains an important physical witness to this history. Peace and war repeatedly alternated. That, rather than a one-dimensional friendship story, is what real frontier relations looked like. Relations with the Uyghurs, the people of the later Uyghur Khaganate, were equally complicated. During the Lushan Rebellion, the Tang court needed their cavalry assistance, creating military alliances as well as trade ties. Uyghur elites received large quantities of silk from the Tang, and the horse-for-silk trade became an important economic connection. Later, when the Uyghur Khaganate collapsed, groups moved south or west, affecting the Tang's northern frontier once again. Ethnic relations were never a static map. They were constantly reshaped by alliances, migration, war, trade, and marriage. Nanzhao reminds us that the Tang frontier was not only about the north and the western regions. The Nanzhao kingdom in Yunnan initially rose with Tang support, but later relations deteriorated. At different moments, Nanzhao allied with or fought Tibet, repeatedly changing its political position. During the Tianbao era, Tang forces suffered a major defeat in Yunnan. In the late Tang, Nanzhao launched repeated attacks in the southwest. Sichuan's importance as a refuge for Xuanzong and later Shizong was also connected to its natural defenses and economic strength. Whenever Chang'an was threatened, emperors repeatedly fled southwest into Shu. Xuanzong did it, and Shizong did as well. The roads into Sichuan were difficult, but the region was relatively defensible, and the fertile Qingdu plain could support a government in exile. Sichuan therefore repeatedly became a second refuge for the Tang court during political crises. It is a perfect example of how geography can shape political decisions. When Emperor Shizong fled to Chengdu, the court continued issuing edicts, appointing officials, and mobilizing troops even while on the run. A state did not stop functioning the instant it lost its capital. Bureaucrats carried seals and documents with them. Wherever the emperor was, a temporary center of government could be established. But the more such a government depended on regional military governors for protection, the weaker its independence became. After Huang Chao withdrew from Chang'an, the city had suffered enormous destruction. For several years afterward, warlords continued fighting over the Guangzhou region. After Zhaozong took the throne, he repeatedly tried to rebuild an imperial guard that belonged directly to the emperor, but his efforts failed. Warlords such as Li Maozhen at times forced the emperor to flee. when an emperor could not guarantee his own safety even near his capital. The gap between the dynasty's name and its actual power had become almost complete. When Zhu Xuanzong forced the move to Luoyang, he even ordered people to dismantle buildings in Chang'an and transport their materials east. Chang'an did not suddenly lose its brilliance on a single day in 907. It was physically dismantled over the course of late Tang warlord struggles. The city that had once symbolized cosmopolitan splendor had become, by the end of the dynasty, one of the clearest physical ruins of imperial decline. Luoyang was not a safe ending either. Once Zhaozong arrived there, he was in fact even more firmly under Zhu Xuanzong's control. After Zhaozong was killed in 904, Emperor Ai had little more than symbolic importance. Even the abdication ceremony of 907 followed elaborate rituals, edicts, and formal procedures, because Zhenguan needed to show that his regime had not simply seized power by force, but had legitimately received the mandate through abdication. Even when the old order had been hollowed out, the new ruler still needed to wrap himself in the legitimacy of the old order. This closely echoed the founding of the Tang in 618. Li Yuan had also not stormed into the palace and simply announced, "I have won." He first installed the Sui Gongdi and then received the throne through abdication. Nearly 3 centuries later, the Tang left history through a political ritual similar to the one through which it had been born. A dynasty that had received the empire from the Sui through formal abdication eventually handed that empire to the later Liang through another abdication. The ceremony looked similar. The direction of power was completely reversed. In 618, the Li Tang regime was a young and energetic military-political coalition, while the Sui Gongdi was the final symbol of an old dynasty. In 907, Zhenguan was the strong man who controlled the armies and the heartland, while Emperor Ai became the final symbol of the old order. History had drawn something close to a vast circle. There is another question that is often overlooked. Just how international was the Tang? If we look only at Chang'an, it is easy to imagine the entire empire as a place where people from every corner of the world interacted every day. In reality, the density of international exchange was concentrated in capitals, major trade routes, frontier zones, and ports. A farmer living in an inland village might never meet a foreign merchant in his lifetime. Yet some of the objects he used, music he heard, or taxes he paid could still be indirectly affected by distant trade. That is often how global exchange actually works. Not everyone travels personally. Goods, technologies, words, and taste travel first. Grapes, pepper, spices, glassware, styles of gold and silver objects, music and dance, and foreign fashions all entered Tang life to varying degrees. In the opposite direction, Chinese silk, paper, craftsmanship, and cultural texts spread outward through merchants, envoys, and religious networks. The Silk Road was never a single road running through a desert. It was a vast network of overland routes, oasis towns, grasslands, and maritime connections. War could destroy one node while another route rose to replace it. This exchange also produced unfamiliarity and prejudice. The people of the Tang were not modern cultural egalitarians. Their sources contained stereotypes and different labels for foreign groups as well. The important point is not to turn the Tang into a utopia without prejudice. It is that even with clear boundaries of identity, different communities could live alongside one another, compete, intermarry, and cooperate for long periods in markets, armies, palaces, temples, and neighborhoods. The Tang military displayed this diversity particularly clearly. Alongside soldiers from the Chinese heartland, people of Turkic, Tiela, Khitan, Shi, Sogdian, and Shadowaa backgrounds all entered the Tang military system at different times. Many commanders had complex ethnic backgrounds but acted as Tang officials. The empire's frontier was not a simple wall dividing us from them. It was more like a contact zone through which people constantly moved. This also helps us understand the meaning of the title Heavenly Kagan. It does not mean that Taizong became the emperor of the entire world. It reflected the willingness of certain political powers in the north and west to recognize his superior authority at particular moments. That authority rested on military victories, political alliances, and the granting of titles. Once Tang power declined, the authority behind the title changed as well. Imperial prestige had to be maintained by real power. A title alone could never preserve it forever. Chang'an's urban planning expressed another kind of order. Its carefully arranged wards and streets, its enormous palace and imperial city, wrote political hierarchy directly into physical space. During the day, officials followed established routes to court, merchants entered the markets, and monks moved through their temples. At night, urban life was restricted by rules such as curfews. Haitang Chang'an was not a modern 24-hour city. Later literature often imagined it as endlessly illuminated, but the real city combined spectacular prosperity with strict regulation. Luoyang, meanwhile, repeatedly played a major political and economic role because it sat close to the grain transport network. Emperor Yang built it as the eastern capital, and the Tang continued to use it. Gaozong and Wu Zetian spent long periods there, and under the Zhou interregnum, it was elevated as the divine capital. The Tang therefore had a durable two-capital structure. Using Chang'an as the only symbol of the entire dynasty can obscure Luoyang's enormous importance in politics, grain supply, and culture. The reason the Lushan rebels captured Luoyang before threatening Chang'an is also connected to this geography. Rebels moving south from Hebei entered Hunan, and Luoyang was a natural strategic target. Once Luoyang was secured, an advance west through Tong Pass could open the way into Guangzhou. Tong Pass was therefore not simply a place name. It was the critical lock protecting Chang'an. Once Geshu Han failed outside the pass, it was as though that lock had been smashed open. The recurring grain shortages in Guangzhou also had a geographic explanation. In the early Tang, the region was wealthy enough to sustain a powerful regime. But as Chang'an's population and the machinery of the state grew, local production was no longer sufficient. The court became dependent on grain transported from elsewhere. A capital that looked almost unimaginably powerful in political terms actually depended every day on distant ships, canals, and warehouses. If war cut those supply lines, even magnificent palaces could not manufacture grain. That is why we cannot study the Tang by looking only at its emperors. What really sustained the Golden Age were warehouses, waterways, postal stations, household registers, ledgers, tax grain, horses, iron, and countless local officials. Once you pull the historical camera away from the Daming Palace and toward the warehouses, you see that imperial power was not an atmosphere. It was an enormous logistical system. And when that logistical system was repeatedly damaged by the Lushan rebellion and the wars of the late Tang, political crises multiplied. An army without food could mutiny. A city without grain could panic. A central government that could no longer collect taxes could not maintain new armies. Finance, military power, and politics formed a self-reinforcing cycle. In a golden age, it was a positive cycle. Stability encouraged production. Production generated revenue. Revenue supported the army, and the army protected stability. In an age of disorder, the cycle ran backward. War destroyed production. Tax revenues fell. Military costs rose. Discipline deteriorated, and local instability deepened. This is the real reason the Tang managed to survive for more than a century after the Li Yuan rebellion. It never fully restored the conditions of the High Tang, but through salt administration, grain transport, the two-tax system, and flexible compromises with the regional military commands, it rebuilt a system that was second best but workable. It was not elegant, but it extended the life of the dynasty. For that reason, the Middle and Late Tang should not be treated simply as the epilogue to the High Tang. It was itself a vast experiment in rebuilding the state. Many later Chinese problems of taxation, local government, and civil administration can be seen in early form during this period. The value of the second half of the Tang is not that it moved farther and farther away from the High Tang. It is that it shows us how a severely wounded empire could continue to function while carrying its injuries. Before we finally assess the Tang, we need to bring several details closer, details that are easily hidden behind labels such as Golden Age and Age of Disorder. The real texture of a dynasty is often found in the spaces between the great events. First, why did the Tang manage to defeat so many rivals at the end of the sway? Once Li Yuan captured Chang'an, he possessed the traditional political heartland of Guangzhou, but enemies still surrounded him to the east, north, and northwest. The Tang's advantage was not that it always had the largest army. It was that it gradually developed a relatively effective mechanism for absorbing political opponents. Local leaders who surrendered could receive titles and office. Commanders from enemy factions could be retained and reused. The experiences of Li Mi after his defeat and of Qin Shubao and Cheng Jijia show that political loyalties in a civil war were not fixed blocks. The Li Tang regime fought its enemies while constantly converting their people, skills, and territories into its own resources. That helps explain why Li Shimin attracted such a diverse circle of talent. These men were not childhood companions. They were military and political figures gathered through the wars of unification. The Prince of Qin's household, therefore, increasingly resembled a small political center of its own. Military victories gave Li Shimin prestige, but they also made Crown Prince Li Jianqing feel threatened. The deeper cause of the brothers' conflict was not simply that one was more ambitious. It was that the founding wars had created two succession networks, both backed by real power. If Li Shimin had been an ordinary prince without troops, victories, or loyal officials, the Xuanwu Gate coup would never have been possible. After Xuanwu Gate, Li Shimin immediately faced another reality. Killing his rivals could win him the throne, but it could not automatically win everyone's trust. The repeated emphasis on remonstrance, talent recruitment, and restraint in the Zhenguan era can therefore also be understood as a form of self-discipline after victory. Li Shimin certainly did not always live up to it. He could be angry, suspicious, and increasingly ambitious for military glory in his later years. But he understood that he could not push the empire back toward the conditions that had destroyed Emperor Yang's sway. The institutions of the early Tang deserve a closer look as well. The 3 departments and 6 ministries system cannot be reduced to the textbook formula: 1 department drafts, 1 reviews, and 1 executes. In practice, political administration was far more complicated. But the core idea was important. Government business beneath the emperor was divided among multiple stages, allowing different offices to restrain one another while still cooperating. The chancellors were not necessarily all occupants of one fixed office either. Men entered the highest decision-making circle through particular titles and assignments. This structure allowed an enormous empire to turn imperial decisions into documents and then transmit them step by step from the capital to the prefectures and counties. The prefectures and counties were where the empire actually met ordinary people. The taxes, labor obligations, and laws decided in the palaces of Chang'an ultimately had to be enforced by local officials. The Tang Code and its commentaries had a profound influence on the legal history of East Asia. They combined ritual principles, social status distinctions, and specific punishments into a relatively coherent legal framework. Modern people, of course, would reject many of its hierarchies, but for a 7th century empire, a broadly unified legal system was itself a major expression of state integration. The land and service systems also supported the order of the early Tang. The equal field system attempted to distribute land according to defined principles, while the Xiangdiao system used household registration and adult male status to collect grain, silk, cloth, and labor. Reality was never as orderly as the statutes. Land concentration, migration, and regional differences remained. Yet during the early Tang recovery, the system helped reconnect people, land, taxes, and military service to the central state. It would later break down precisely because those elements gradually ceased to correspond to one another. The glory of the Zhenguan military campaigns rested on an even more complicated frontier world. After Li Jing defeated the Eastern Turks, large numbers of Turkic people entered the Tang political order. Some were settled in frontier areas, while some leaders received Tang titles. The Tang did not simply transform steppe society into ordinary Chinese counties. It used different forms of rule according to local circumstances. Indirectly administered prefectures, protectorates, investiture, treaties, and odes formed a highly flexible frontier system. That flexibility was a major source of Tang expansion, but also meant that central control could rise or fall rapidly with military conditions. Taizong's later campaign against Goguryeo offers the opposite lesson. In 645, Li Shimin personally led an expedition against Goguryeo. The Tang captured several fortresses but met stubborn resistance, especially at Ansi, and eventually withdrew. Popular memory often turns Taizong into the invincible heavenly Kagan. The historical Li Shimin, however, could lose wars. An empire's military advantages are never unlimited. Terrain, supply lines, weather, and local resistance can all change the outcome. Under Gaozong, the Tang achieved greater success against the Western Turks and Goguryeo. Around 657, the forces of Ashina-Helu were defeated, and Tang political and military institutions were extended and reorganized across the western regions. In the 660s, the Tang cooperated with Silla to attack Beach, which fell. Goguryeo followed in 668. But victory immediately produced a new conflict. Tang China and Silla began competing over control of the former territories of Goguryeo and Beach, and Silla ultimately established control over most of the Korean peninsula. International alliances, in other words, often remain stable only while a common enemy exists. Once that enemy disappears, former allies recalculate their interests. The relationship between Gaozong and Wu Zetian is also more complicated than the simple story of a weak husband controlled by a powerful wife. Gaozong ruled for more than 3 decades and had his own independent political record during the first half of his reign. Wu Zetian's rise took place through competition among the emperor, empress, imperial relatives, established officials, and newer bureaucratic figures. After she displaced Empress Wang and became empress, she gradually took part in government, especially as Gaozong's health deteriorated. Their cooperation and rivalry were intertwined, and the experience gave Wu Zetian an extraordinary education in ruling. After Gaozong's death, Wu Zetian controlled Zhongzong and Ruizong in succession. Her central obstacle was not simply whether a woman could govern. Traditional political legitimacy was built around a male imperial line and the Li royal clan. If she wanted to become emperor in her own name, she had to explain why a woman of the Wu surname could legitimately replace the son of heaven of the Li house. She therefore used omens, religious prophecies, ritual changes, new titles, and altered official terminology to construct a new language of legitimacy. Luoyang became especially important during this period, serving as a central political hub of the Zhou regime. Wu Zetian's emphasis on official recruitment also altered the political structure. She needed to bypass some traditional aristocratic families and old Tang officials, so she was willing to rely more heavily on men who rose through examinations and recommendation. Figures such as Di Renjie and the future Chancellor Yao Chong were shaped by political experience during the Zhou period. Wu therefore did 2 contradictory things at once. She persecuted opponents while also helping create part of the generation of talent that would later support the Kaiyuan government. History often works that way. A policy can be oppressive and institutionally innovative at the same time. The politics of ruthless investigators is another side of Wu Zetian's reign that cannot be ignored. Men such as Li Junxin and Zhou Xing used denunciations, interrogations, and fabricated charges to destroy political enemies, creating a climate of fear. Wu gradually reduced the power of these officials in her later years, but she could not erase the political trauma they had created. Her rule, therefore, remains difficult to summarize in simple terms. She proved that a woman could become emperor in the fullest political sense, but she also showed that breaking through traditional boundaries did not automatically make politics gentler. After the Xunlong coup, Zhongzong returned to the throne and new alliances formed among Wu Sanxi, Empress Wei, Princess Annal, and others. Palace politics became a web in which marriages, mother-daughter relationships, imperial identity, and bureaucratic factions were all intertwined. After Zhongzong died in 710, Wei's faction was swiftly destroyed by Li Longji and Princess Taiping. Li Longji did not succeed merely through personal courage. By then, he already had support inside the imperial guard and among members of the royal family. He would soon break with Princess Taiping as well. The beginning of the Kaiyuan era was itself the product of a ruthless struggle for political supremacy. The young Xuanzong had learned from the previous decades and placed particular value on capable chancellors. Yao Chong advocated administrative reform. Song Jing became known for his commitment to law and principle. Zhang Jiuling was an important chancellor in the later Kaiyuan years. Their styles differed, but they shared one quality. When the emperor himself remained energetic and engaged, they could form a relatively effective decision-making team. Xuanzong was not simply sitting in Chang'an enjoying peace. He traveled, performed state rituals, adjusted institutions and finances, and tried to keep an already expanded empire efficient. The economic growth of the Kaiyuan period depended heavily on population recovery and transport between north and south. Guangzhou itself could not permanently feed the enormous population of Chang'an and the armies and court that surrounded it. Grain from Shandong, Hunan, and the Jianghuai region was therefore essential. The Yellow River, Bian Canal, and Grand Canal connected political centers with agricultural zones. As long as grain transport functioned smoothly, Chang'an could remain magnificent. Once war disrupted the routes, the capital's vulnerability appeared immediately. Haitang exchange of the outside world also should not be reduced to the phrase, "all nations came to pay tribute." Many foreign envoys were also involved in trade. Sogdian merchants from Central Asia were active for generations along the Silk Road and in Chinese cities. Students from Silla and Japan studied in the Tang and later helped shape institutions and culture in their home countries. Objects, patterns, and music from West and Central Asia entered Tang society, while Chinese silk, ceramics, and cultural products traveled outward. Cultural exchange was not one-way influence. Both sides were continually changing one another. In such cities, entertainment naturally flourished. Court academies, music institutions, wine houses, and private banquets all needed musicians and dancers. The whirling dances of Central Asian origin became famous, while instruments such as the pipa, Kongho harp, and Billy oboe appeared in courtly and popular settings. Tang art feels especially foreign to modernize precisely because the imperial center remained connected to the larger Eurasian transportation network for so long. At the same time, the edges of the empire were becoming increasingly militarized. During Xuanzong's reign, several judushi were strengthened, and frontier commanders often gained control over troops, finances, and administration at once. Earlier, the central armies in the heartland had been relatively strong, while frontier forces remained more limited. By the Tianbao era, enormous military concentrations were increasingly placed along the borders. Lu Shan's control of three major commands was the most extreme expression of this trend. Lu Shan was also exceptionally skilled at palace politics. He won Xuanzong's trust and even established a symbolic relationship with Yang Guifei as her adopted son, often amusing the emperor with exaggerated performances. A frontier general who commanded enormous forces could appear inside the palace as a loyal and harmless court favorite. That contrast was part of what made him so dangerous. The court was not entirely blind, of course. Zhang Jiuling and others had already warned about the excessive power of certain commanders. But before rebellion actually occurred, openly accusing a successful general who enjoyed the emperor's confidence also carried political risks. In the winter of 755, Lu Shan marched south from Fanyang. His rebel army broke through the defenses with the strength of frontier cavalry and experienced soldiers. Hebei did not respond as one unified bloc of rebels or loyalists. Officials, local elites, and ordinary people made different choices under enormous pressure. Yin Gaoqing and Yin Jinqing organized resistance in Hebei, showing that Lushan did not automatically receive everyone's support. Meanwhile, the rebels used major transport routes to move rapidly toward Luoyang. After Luoyang fell, the Xuanzong court panicked. Feng Changqing and Gao Xinji withdrew toward Tong Pass, but a eunuch named Bian Lingcheng accused them of wrongdoing, and both experienced generals were executed. Killing two capable commanders during the opening stage of the crisis was one of the most tragic decisions of the entire rebellion. Geshu Han then took over the defense of Tong Pass. He originally favored holding the pass, but the central government repeatedly demanded action. He was eventually forced to march out and suffered a crushing defeat. After Xuanzong fled west, the mutiny at Mawei Station did more than end Yang Guifei's life. It marked the end of Xuanzong's era as the empire's effective supreme ruler. When Crown Prince Li Heng went north to Lingwu and declared himself emperor, he did so without first receiving a formal abdication from Xuanzong. It was a transfer of power made under the pressure of war. Xuanzong eventually had no choice but to accept the reality and become retired emperor. Suzong's campaign against the rebels depended heavily on the Shuafang forces, armies from Heshi and Longyu, and Uyghur auxiliaries. Foreign military assistance came at a price. The Tang court had to provide wealth and political concessions in return. The war pulled forces from across the empire's frontiers into the Central Plains. Guozi and Li Guangbi repeatedly played crucial roles on the battlefield, but the court itself was full of suspicion. Eunuchs such as Yu Qian began to gain greater influence over military supervision. The rebel camp was also consumed by internal violence. Lushan was ill and increasingly violent in his later years before being killed by his own son in Qingshu. Shi Siming later killed in Qingshu and proclaimed himself emperor. Shi Siming was then killed by his own son, Shi Chaoyi. This succession of assassinations and coups showed that the rebel regime had no stable mechanism for transferring power. Yet the Tang still could not win quickly, because the military forces in Hebei had already developed their own logic of survival. After Shi Chaoyi's defeat in 763, the Tang court wanted the war to end as quickly as possible. It therefore offered pardons and recognition to many former rebel commanders, allowing them to continue governing the regions they already controlled. This was a classic decision that was correct in the short term, but extremely expensive in the long run. If the court had pursued every rebel to the bitter end, the war might have continued for many more years. By accepting surrender, it could restore nominal unity immediately. But the regional commands eventually came to treat their armies and territories as hereditary bases of power, making it extraordinarily difficult for the center to take control back. The three Hebei commands are the best-known example, but the Tang's military provinces were never all the same. Many commands in the southeast were responsible for fiscal transport. In some regions, the central government still appointed officials directly. In the northwest, military commanders faced the constant pressure of Tibet. Some Hebei commands enjoyed much greater autonomy. Coloring the entire late Tang map with one shade labeled warlordism would hide the real power the central government still possessed. Many regional commands continued to pay some taxes, accept imperial appointments, and participate in wars launched by the court. Another crucial change under Taizong and Dizong was the increasingly deep military role of the eunuchs. Eunuchs had existed since the early Tang, but their political influence had initially been more limited. By Xuanzong's later years, Gao Lishir was already a major court figure. After the Lushan rebellion, men such as Li Fugua, Cheng Yuanjin, and Yu Qian gained much greater military and political power. Why were emperors willing to use eunuchs? Because eunuchs had no local clan network or traditional bureaucratic base, and were often seen by the emperor as more personal and therefore more reliable agents. But once they controlled the imperial guard and the emperor's channels of daily information, that private reliability could become a structural threat. The Shin's army, originally connected to the Northwestern defense system, eventually became the core of the Central Imperial Guard and remained under eunuch command for decades. To the emperor, it was an essential force for preventing regional commanders from threatening the capital directly. To the eunuchs, it was the foundation of their transformation from palace servants into political kingmakers. Late Tang eunuchs could influence who became emperor not simply because they whispered into someone's ear. They had soldiers in their hands. After the Zhenguan mutiny, Taizong became less trusting of civilian and military officials and increasingly dependent on eunuchs and palace favorites. The mutiny itself also revealed how fragile military finances could be. Soldiers sent far from home had to receive proper pay and provisions. If those promises failed, loyalty could turn into anger very quickly. Ancient imperial armies were not abstract symbols. Soldiers had to eat, receive rewards, and support their families. When the financial chain broke, the political chain could break with it. Xuanzong was able to launch the Yuan campaigns against the military governors because earlier fiscal reforms gave the court some resources and because he was careful in choosing his targets. Wu Yuanji of Huaishi was not necessarily the most powerful regional commander, but he was an ideal target for demonstrating that the central government still had teeth. The war lasted for years, and there were voices inside the court calling for compromise. Peidu insisted on continuing the campaign, and Li Su's surprise attack on Kai Prefecture finally succeeded. After the victory, powerful commands such as Chengde and Lulong temporarily submitted to the center, and the Yuan restoration reached its high point. After Xuanzong's death, however, some of those gains quickly began to unravel. Under Muzong, the Hebei commands rebelled again, and the central government no longer had the same ability to suppress them. Once again, the lesson was clear. Institutional problems cannot be solved permanently by the arrival of one strong emperor. If a system requires a political genius in every generation simply to keep working, the system itself is unstable. The Xuanwu incident under Wenzong was the most dramatic failure of imperial resistance to the eunuchs. Once the plot was exposed, eunuchs led by Qiu Shiyang seized control of the emperor and brought him back into the palace. The Shen's army mobilized, and Li Sun, Wang Ye, and many other officials were killed. Even officials who had not participated in the core conspiracy were caught in the purge. The people of Chang'an watched senior officials arrested and executed, and the prestige of the court suffered a devastating blow. From then on, many scholar officials understood an uncomfortable truth. An emperor who wanted to kill the eunuchs needed a secret coup rather than a simple imperial decree. The Huichang persecution of Buddhism again entangled finance, politics, and ideology. Buddhist temples owned large amounts of land and employed or supported many people who were outside ordinary systems of taxation and labor service. During a fiscal crisis, the state could therefore see monasteries as a major loss of taxable resources. Wuzong's personal devotion to Taoism was one factor, but it was not the only one. After the persecution, huge numbers of monks and nuns returned to lay life, and temple property was confiscated, dealing an enormous blow to organized Buddhism. Yet, once Wuzong died and Xuanzong became emperor, the policy was quickly relaxed and Buddhism recovered. This shows how strongly an emperor's personal beliefs could shape state policy, but also how difficult it was to destroy a religious tradition that had already become deeply embedded in society. Late Tang change was also visible in cities and commerce. Yangzhou became extraordinarily prosperous because of the Grand Canal and the salt trade. Guangzhou connected China to maritime commerce. Chengdu, Jiangling, and other regional centers remained important. The weakening of the political center did not mean that every part of the empire fell into decline. Some southern regions actually continued to grow because they were farther from the principal northern battlefields. Those developments later helped provide the economic foundations of several southern regimes during the Five Dynasties and Ten Kingdoms period. The enormous geographical reach of the Huang Chao Rebellion shows that the same transportation networks that served the empire could also be used by forces resisting it. Rebel armies were able to move rapidly through Hunan, Jiangnan, Fujian, and Lingnan before turning north again. They depended on roads, markets, transport routes, and local information. A highly connected society encourages trade when order is stable. When order breaks down, the same connections can allow disorder to spread even faster. The exact number of people killed when Huang Chao attacked Guangzhou varies greatly across the historical sources, and later accounts often contain enormous exaggerations. It would therefore be unsafe to treat any spectacular figure as certain. What we can say is that prolonged war and siege badly affected the city's population and overseas commerce. By the time Huang Chao moved north and entered Chang'an, his main problem had become how to feed a huge army. Guangzhou had already suffered years of upheaval and chronic food shortages. The rebel government struggled to build stable finances, while weak discipline and escalating violence made the situation worse. Li Qiong and his Shadowwa cavalry played a major role in the suppression of Huang Chao, providing another example of the changing ethnic and military structure of the late Tang. The Shadowwa had originally been one branch of the broader Turkic world. Through migration and long participation in the Tang frontier system, they gradually became a major military force. The Tang court granted Li Qiong the imperial surname Li and elevated him to high office. His descendants later founded the later Tang and continued to present themselves as inheritors of the Tang legacy. In its final decades, the Great Tang depended on a military group with a frontier, non-Han background to defend the dynasty, and that same group later became one of the foundations of a successor state. This is one of the clearest examples of how complicated the Tang's multi-ethnic imperial legacy could be. The rivalry between Zhenguan and Li Qiong gradually became the most important external framework in the final years of the Tang. Zhenguan controlled Bianzhou and key transportation and grain routes across the Central Plains and was a highly skilled political operator. Li Qiong held Hedong and commanded formidable cavalry forces. They had once fought Huang Chao together, but quickly became bitter enemies. Emperor Taizong tried to balance the warlords against one another, but the center found it increasingly difficult to act as referee because it no longer possessed enough independent power of its own. Zhu Wen's most dangerous quality was not simply military strength. He understood how to use the Tang name to legitimize his expansion step by step. He accepted appointments as military governor and royal titles. He allowed the emperor's government to issue orders in support of his actions. Then he steadily removed the people at court whom he could not control. By the end, he did not need to do what Lushan had done and openly declare rebellion before marching on Chang'an. He could dominate the Tang from inside the banner of serving the dynasty, then arrange for the dynasty to hand him the throne through formal procedure. After Taizong was killed in 904, a group of officials still tried to preserve the rituals and administrative procedures of the court. But in the 905 White Horse Station massacre, Zhu Wen had another large group of officials killed, dealing a severe blow to the traditional scholar-official elite. The event symbolized the further destruction of the old Tang central establishment. By the time the abdication took place in 907, almost nothing remained with the strength to stop it. The fall of the Tang was therefore both a military defeat and a long process in which its legitimacy was hollowed out. Zhu Wen did not destroy a complete empire in a single day. He took over the shell of a central government that had already been shattered by military governors, eunuchs, rebellions, and decades of warlord conflict. His final task was simply to change the dynastic name, stand in Luoyang in 907, and watch Emperor Ai hand over the throne. And it is easy to reach a simple conclusion. The Great Tang had lost. It had failed to solve the problems in its military structure. It had failed to rebuild a central authority strong enough to control the provinces. It had failed to prevent local warlords from tearing the empire apart. What came next was the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms, an era in which northern regimes changed rapidly while multiple southern states coexisted. From that perspective, the Tang's ending was undeniably a failure. But pull the camera farther back, and the Great Tang did not truly lose. First came its institutions. The 3 departments and 6 ministries, the examination system, the legal tradition, and administrative practices of the Tang had an enormous influence on later history. Many were not Tang inventions. They inherited earlier ideas from the Sui and previous dynasties. But the Tang developed and expanded them and made them function for a long period inside a reunified empire. Later states across East Asia also studied these institutions. Japanese envoys traveled to Tang China not only to bring back poetry and Buddhist scriptures, but also to study urban planning, ritual, government, and cultural forms. Silla and Tang fought, as well as exchanged ideas. Tang influence was never a one-way export. It spread through conflict, imitation, and creative transformation. Second was the connection between cities and the wider world. Chang'an may not have been the single center of the world in any modern sense, but it was unquestionably one of the most important international cities in Eurasia at the time. People from many regions gathered there, and foreign music, dance, clothing, food, religion, and artistic styles continually collided with local traditions. The foreign figures, camels, musicians, grape motifs, and Central Asian imagery visible in Tang tomb murals, sculptures, metalwork, and documents were not decorative fantasies. They were traces of real cross-cultural exchange. And then there was literature. When a dynasty falls, administrative orders stop working, armies change masters, and palaces can burn. Poems do not disappear with a dynastic calendar. Li Bai, Du Fu, Wang Wei, Bai Juyi, Han Yu, Lu Zhenguan, Li Shimin, and Du Mu give later generations countless entrances into the emotional world of the Tang. Through them we hear the confidence of the High Tang and the pain of the Lushan rebellion, the dust of the frontier and the music of Chang'an at night, the loneliness of an exiled official on a riverbank, and the helplessness of a coal seller caught inside a system of power. Tang poetry and prose left the empire with thousands of different doors through which later generations could enter its world. On an even deeper level, the Tang helped shape a Chinese character that later generations would imagine again and again. Powerful without being completely closed, committed to order while remaining capable of absorbing outside cultures, and able to sustain an imperial identity alongside many different peoples. The real Tang was, of course, much less romantic than later memory suggests. It contained brutal wars, palace massacres, ethnic conflict, social inequality, and religious persecution. But precisely because it was not a perfect poster of Golden Age, we can understand its significance more clearly. Tang openness did not exist because everyone suddenly became tolerant. It existed because a powerful empire had needs, confidence, and the capacity to incorporate different cultures into everyday life. When political and financial conditions changed, that openness could contract as well. Return to the question with which we began. Why was such a powerful Tang empire ultimately torn apart by the forces it had created? The answer is now visible. To defend an enormous frontier, the Tang granted immense military authority to the Jidushi that allowed its armies to fight far from the capital, but it also gave regional commanders the resources they needed to challenge the center. To survive the Lushan rebellion, the court depended on local armies and a series of temporary compromises. Those compromises saved the dynasty, but they also made it almost impossible to reclaim complete control. To resist the regional military governors, emperors strengthened the Shen's army under unit command. They gave the throne a seemingly reliable guard while giving the eunuchs the weapon with which to control the emperor. To preserve the state, the Tang relied on salt taxes and new fiscal systems, such as the two-tax system, but those systems also created new layers of pressure on society. Through examinations and bureaucracy, the court recruited talent, yet it could not eliminate the long-term political exhaustion caused by factional conflict. The Tang was therefore not destroyed by one bad man. Lushan mattered. Yang Guozhong mattered. The eunuchs mattered. Huang Chao mattered. Zhenguan mattered most of all as the final destroyer. But if 3 centuries of history are reduced to corrupt ministers ruin the country, or a beautiful woman cause disaster, then the real mechanisms of history disappear. The rise and fall of an empire is never a multiple-choice question with a single correct answer. Even the Lushan rebellion cannot simply be described as the sudden end of the Golden Age. Before 755, important changes had already taken place. The growing professionalization of frontier armies had altered the military structure. The power of military governors had expanded. Frontier warfare demanded more and more resources. Court politics depended increasingly on a few powerful individuals. And Lushan was like a match, but what allowed the fire to consume half the empire was the dry timber that had already been stacked inside the room. The fall of the Tang in 907 was likewise not caused by the Huang Chao rebellion alone. Huang Chao's movement could sweep across so much of China because local government and regional military order had already weakened severely. To suppress Huang Chao, the Tang had to rely on men such as Li Qiong and Zhu Chuanzhou. Once the rebellion was defeated, the people who gained the greatest political rewards were the warlords who commanded their own armies. In other words, the empire created its final gravediggers while trying to save itself. That is what makes the Tang story so compelling. History never tells people in advance which choice will lead to disaster. When Xuanzong strengthened frontier commanders, he saw military efficiency. When Suzong and Daizong compromised with regional powers, they saw a way to end the war. When Dizong relied on eunuchs to command the central guard, he saw a way to prevent another provincial army from driving the emperor out of Chang'an. When late Tang rulers used warlords to eliminate the eunuchs, they believed they were finally solving a century-old problem. Each decision had a practical reason when viewed on its own, but together, those choices transformed the structure of power across the entire state. The most realistic tragedies in history do not happen because everyone makes foolish decisions. They happen because many people at their own moment in time make the choice that seems most reasonable, and those choices eventually push the people who come later into narrower and narrower paths. But even if we understand all of this politically, we still miss half the Tang. Because what later generations remember most vividly is also its life. In the Western market of Chang'an, you might meet merchants speaking different languages. In taverns, images of Central Asian women and musicians continually entered Tang poetry. Instruments such as the long-neck pipa and five-string pipa arrived and evolved through Silk Road exchange, while Central Asian dances such as the whirlwind dance and hudong became fashionable. Some people wore narrow-sleeved, round-collared robes. Women rode horses in public. Noble tomb murals preserve scenes of attendance, polo, banquets, and travel. Tang people loved flowers, wine, music, and strange new things from distant places. The ward and market system imposed a strict spatial order on the city, but as the era changed, commercial activity increasingly pushed beyond the original boundaries. Tea became increasingly popular during the Tang. Li Yuan wrote the classic of tea, transforming drinking tea from a simple habit into a cultural practice with its own system of knowledge and aesthetic meaning. Tea produced in the south spread northward, helped by commercial networks and a more integrated market. Later, tea would become not only a drink, but a source of state revenue and a commodity traded across the frontier. Even an ordinary tea bowl could connect Tang economics, transportation, culture, and politics. Women's lives were also far more complicated than the stories of Wu Zetian and Yang Guifei suggest. Images from elite Tang society give later viewers a sense of relative openness in women's clothing, travel, and social life, leading to the easy claim that Tang women were especially free. That needs to be treated cautiously. Social class mattered enormously. Law and family structures remained powerful, and the daily lives of ordinary women were nowhere near as carefree as the murals and palace stories might suggest. Yet compared with some later periods, elite Tang women did have more visible forms of participation in public life, property, and marriage practices. The interesting history is not to package all Tang women as modern independent women, but to understand the concrete space available to them within the institutions of their own time. The religious world was even more diverse. Buddhist temples spread across cities and villages. Taoism enjoyed special prestige because the Li imperial family claimed descent from Laozi. Foreign religions, such as Zoroastrianism, Christianity of the Church of the East, and Manichaeism also existed and developed during the Tang. The 781 Nestorian stele is an important surviving physical record of the spread of a foreign religion in Tang China. Religion was not confined to intellectual history. It influenced festivals, charity, art, burial, travel, diplomacy, and even political legitimacy. Wu Zetian used Buddhist symbols to strengthen her claim to the throne. Wuzong later launched a massive persecution of Buddhism. Within the same dynasty, the state's attitude toward religion could change dramatically. Art was constantly being blended and remade. Tang Sankai pottery, with its camels, horses, and foreigner figurines, gives us an almost direct visual impression of the Silk Road. Gold and silver objects incorporated techniques and designs from Central and West Asia, then recreated them in a Chinese setting. The murals of Dunhuang preserve enormous amounts of religious and secular imagery from the Tang and surrounding periods. The calligraphy of Yin Zhenxing and Lu Gongquan was not merely aesthetic. It was also connected to official identity, moral reputation, political character, and later cultural memory. Move the camera from the palace to the roads, and you see another Tang entirely, an empire in motion. Officials traveled to new appointments. Merchants traveled to trade. Monks traveled to seek teachings. Armies marched to war. Candidates traveled to the capital for examinations. Exiled poets traveled because they had no choice. The Grand Canal moved grain and other resources from Jiangnan to the north in a constant stream. Grain transport was one of the vital arteries that kept Chang'an, Luoyang, the bureaucracy, and the armies alive. After the Lushan Rebellion, the devastation of the north, and the growing economic importance of Jiangnan made the central government even more dependent on revenue from the southeast. The long-term movement of China's economic center southward was already becoming clearer. That produced another striking contrast. The political center of the Tang remained in the north, with Chang'an and Luoyang as its major capitals, but the economic power sustaining the state increasingly came from the southeast. The central government had to keep canals and transport routes open. Any regional commander, rebellion, or local power that cut the grain shipments could push the capital toward famine. The struggle between center and local power was therefore not simply about who obeyed whom. It was also about who controlled the routes through which wealth moved. The worldview of Tang people also changed. Early Tang society carried the confidence of a newly unified order. During the High Tang, military expansion and cultural exchange encouraged a powerful sense of universal empire. After the Lushan Rebellion, people began to understand that the empire was not invulnerable. By the late Tang, poets constantly moved between prosperous cities, damaged politics, and personal disappointment. Dumu wrote about the rise and fall of earlier dynasties while reflecting on his own late Tang world. Li Shangyin's gorgeous, shadowy, ambiguous poetry seemed almost perfectly suited to an age whose culture remained refined on the surface, while politics became increasingly uncertain underneath. So imagine that we could board a time-traveling train and ride from 618 all the way to 907. The colors outside the window would keep changing. At the beginning, There would be the smoke and dust of the late Sui. Roads would be filled with armies and refugees. Chang'an had only just been seized by Li Yuan, and no one knew whether this new regime would survive. Then you would see Li Shimin's cavalry racing near Hulao Pass. You would hear the snap of a bowstring at Xuanwu Gate, brothers falling, and a young emperor taking the throne through blood. Farther on, you would see the fields slowly recovering during Zhenguan, foreign envoys entering Chang'an, and Xuanzong returning with scriptures. The train would continue, and you would watch Wu Zetian rise step by step from empress to empress dowager, and then to emperor. For a time, the dynasty's name was no longer Tang, yet the bureaucratic machinery of Chang'an and Luoyang kept running. Then came the Shenlong coup. The Li Tang house was restored. Several palace coups flashed through the gates like lightning. Li Longji appeared, eliminated his rivals, and the Kaiyuan Golden Age began. Now the view outside the window would be brightest. Chang'an's markets will be crowded. Music from different regions would mingle in the streets. Poets filled with ambition would come to the capital. The frontier armies would grow more powerful, and the imperial map would look astonishing. But the danger would also be growing precisely where the light was brightest. In 755, the train would suddenly shake, and Lushan would rebel. Luoyang would fall. Tong Pass would collapse. Xuanzong would flee. In the dust of Maowei Station, Yang Guifei would die. Dufu would be swept into the war. Ordinary people would scatter. Chang'an would change hands again and again. The Hai Tang would not fade like a lamp slowly running out of oil. It would be more like a brilliantly lit hall whose doors suddenly blow open, sending sparks racing into the curtains. But the train would keep moving. You would then see Daizong and Dizong trying to rebuild the ruins. Salt revenue, the two-tax system, regional military commands, and the Shin's army would become the new political vocabulary. You would see the Jingyuan mutiny forcing the emperor out of Chang'an again. You would see Li Su carrying out his surprise attack on Kai Prefecture through deep snow. You would see central power briefly recover under Shenzong. Farther on, the shadows inside the palace would grow longer. Eunuchs could decide who lived and who became emperor. After the failure of the Xuanwu incident, officials' bodies would lie in the streets of Chang'an. Wuzong would persecute Buddhism. Xuanzong would try to restore order. News would arrive from Hushi that some territory had returned to Tang allegiance. The empire would still look alive, but increasingly it would resemble an old and experienced man covered in scars and chronic illness. Finally, Huang Chao's armies would sweep from south to north across the land, and Shizong would flee into Sichuan. Chang'an would fall once again. Shadowwa cavalry, regional armies, and the former rebel commander Zhu would become the people deciding the fate of China. When Huang Chao was finally defeated, the Great Tang would be even weaker than before. Zhaozong would still try to resist, but he would have fewer and fewer cards left to play. Zhu Chuanzhong would force the capital to Luoyang, kill Zhaozong, and enthrone Emperor Ai. In 907, the final imperial edict carrying the name Great Tang would still exist on paper, but its power would be gone. The train arrives, but when we step off, we discover that there is no true final stop. After the later Liang was founded, Li Qiong's son Li Kongsu would later destroy the later Liang and establish the later Tang, once again drawing on the political memory of the Tang. Some southern regimes also continued to use the institutions, culture, and bureaucratic traditions inherited from the Tang. The 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms were full of wars, But civilization did not suddenly fall into darkness. The economic centers, urban networks, and educated elite culture that had developed under the Tang continued to evolve and were eventually integrated again under the Song. Song scholars read Tang poetry, studied Tang prose, and debated the political successes and failures of the dynasty. Later calligraphers copied the works of Yin Zhenxing and Lu Gongquan. Poets continually returned to Li Bai and Du Fu as peaks of literary achievement. Cities and temples preserved Tang remains. The Shosoin repository in Japan still holds large numbers of Tang objects and objects influenced by Tang culture, giving later generations another window onto the mobility of the great Tang world. Even today, the term Chinatown uses the word Tang as part of the cultural identity associated with China. A dynasty that died in 907 still lives in its name in the modern world. That is the truly astonishing thing about the Tang. Its political life had an ending, but its cultural life did not stop there. Of course, we cannot turn the Tang into a legend without shadows. The Golden Age did not mean peace. The wars of early unification caused enormous casualties. Taizong and Gaozong launched repeated foreign campaigns, and soldiers and frontier communities paid heavy costs. High Tang prosperity did not mean everyone was wealthy. Social inequality and differences of status remained. Openness was never unlimited. The Huichong persecution of Buddhism is a powerful counterexample. Relations among different peoples were never permanently peaceful either. The Tang alternated between trade, marriage alliances, diplomacy, and long periods of conflict with the Turks, Tibet, Nanzhao, and other powers. A history worth respecting does not need to erase its shadows in order to preserve its brilliance. On the contrary, once we know the blood of Xuanwu Gate, the dead of the Lushan Rebellion, the fear of the Ganlu Incident, and the destruction caused by the Huangchao Wars, we can look again at Tang poetry, Chang'an, the Silk Road, and Tang institutions and understand that a great era was never a fairy tale. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Tang is that strength is never a static condition. When a country is at its most powerful, it is often creating new problems at the same time. The larger the territory, the higher the cost of defending it. The more professional the army, the greater the political influence of military groups. The more prosperous the cities, the more complicated the fiscal and commercial networks. The larger the bureaucracy, the more intense internal competition becomes. The deeper the external connections, the more strongly changes in the international environment can affect domestic politics. A golden age is not the end of history. It is a delicate balance that must constantly be maintained and adjusted. Why did Li Shimin repeatedly talk about the fall of Sui? Because he knew that a powerful dynasty could collapse in a remarkably short time. Why was Xuanzong so diligent in the first part of his reign? Because he had lived through the palace chaos of the final Zhou period and the reign of Zhongzong. Why did Dizong want to curb the regional military governors? Because he knew that one of the roots of the Lushan crisis was excessive local military power. Why did Wenzong take the enormous risk of launching the Ganlu Incident? Because he could no longer tolerate eunuchs controlling the throne. Why did Zhaozong repeatedly try to rebuild the imperial guard? Because an emperor without an army could only become a seal in the hands of a warlord. Every generation responds to the problems left by the previous one, while creating new problems for the next. That is what makes history truly continuous. There is another simple way to understand the 3 centuries of the Tang. Ask who controlled Chang'an. In 617, Li Yuan entered Chang'an and held the decisive power. In 626, during the Xuanwu Gate coup, Li Shimin controlled the palace gates, and he held the decisive power. Under Wu Zetian, the political center moved between Chang'an and Luoyang, and she held the decisive power. During Yuan, Xuanzong sat in the Daming Palace while officials and envoys across the realm looked toward imperial authority. In 756, as rebels approached and Xuanzong fled, Chang'an proved for the first time that an emperor could lose his capital. In 763, Tibetan forces briefly entered Chang'an, placing the collapse of the frontier directly outside the palace gates. In 783, the Zhenguan mutiny forced Taizong to flee again. In 881, Huang Chao entered Chang'an, and a leader of a popular rebellion proclaimed himself emperor inside the palace. By the end of the 9th century, whoever controlled the Shen's army and the military commands around the capital could influence the emperor. Finally, Zhu Xuanzong simply moved the emperor and much of the population to Luoyang, stripping Chang'an of its role as the political heart of the Tang. The changing control of a single city is like an electrocardiogram of the empire's power. Now look at who controlled the armies. In the early Tang, the emperor could rely on the central system and the phubbing to mobilize military resources. As the empire expanded, professional frontier armies and military governors became more important. After the Lushan Rebellion, both regional commands and the Central Imperial Guard grew powerful. To counter the regional commands, eunuchs took control of the Shen's army and became essential to the throne. By the late Tang, the Shen's army itself had become corrupt and increasingly localized, forcing the court to rely on outside warlords once again. Eventually, Zhu won, an outside military strongman, entered the center. The Tang ended. That single chain almost connects the entire logic of the Tang's rise and fall. Now ask where the money came from. The early Tang depended on the Xiangdiao system, built around household registration, land, and adult male status. After the Lushan Rebellion destroyed much of that structure, the two-tax system became central. Salt monopolies and revenue from the southeast grew increasingly important. The central government had to protect the Grand Canal and the economic lifeline of the Zhanghuai region. Regional military commands, meanwhile, often withheld or redirected revenue. Whoever controlled the money could maintain soldiers. Whoever could maintain soldiers could influence politics. Finance was never a dry set of numbers. It was the blood of the empire. Culture followed a very different curve. Political authority weakened in the middle and late Tang, yet literature remained brilliant. Central control over the provinces declined, while cities and commercial activity in Jiangnan continued to develop. Imperial territory contracted, but cross-cultural exchange did not suddenly disappear. That is why the decline of the Tang cannot mean that every part of Tang society declined at the same time. Political, economic, cultural, and regional development never move in perfect synchrony. That also helps explain the strange beauty of late Tang writing. The closer an age comes to uncertainty, the more complicated writers' feelings about the past, love, politics, and fate can become. Li Shimin lived inside factional politics and bureaucratic networks, and his poetry is often indirect and deeply layered. Dumu wrote about the rise and fall of earlier dynasties, while carrying contemporary anxieties of his own. The late Tang was not an inferior copy of the High Tang. It had its own distinctive aesthetics and spiritual world. Wu Zetian likewise cannot be treated as a mere interruption in Tang history. Her reign revealed the flexibility of the Tang political system. The dynastic name could change from Tang to Zhou. The emperor could change from a male member of the Li house to a woman of the Wu family. Yet the enormous bureaucratic, fiscal, and local administrative system continued functioning. When the Qianlong coup restored the Tang name, much of the institutional machinery did not have to be rebuilt from nothing. This tells us that a mature empire was no longer a private estate belonging simply to one family. The dynastic surname mattered enormously, but the machinery of the state had a continuity beyond any single individual. That is also why the Tang could survive so many palace crises. The bloodshed at Xuanwu Gate did not immediately destroy the state. Wu Zetian's change of dynasty did not shut down administration. The repeated coups under Zhongzong and Ruizong did not instantly divide the countryside. What eventually made recovery impossible was not palace politics alone. It was the moment when central finances, military resources, and local control were all damaged at the same time. Once that happened, changing emperors could no longer change the structure. Imagine the Great Tang as a huge ship that sailed for nearly 3 centuries. Li Yuan and Li Shimin launched it and brought it under control. During Zhenguan and Yonghui, the hull became stable and the routes expanded. Under Wu Zetian, the captain changed, but the ship itself remained largely intact. During Kaiyuan, the ship was loaded with wealth and passengers and reached its greatest speed. But in order to sail farther, the court handed more and more control to frontier fleets. The Lushan rebellion was like one of the strongest fleets suddenly turning around and firing on the ship itself, blowing a huge hole in the hull. During the Middle Tang, the crew fought desperately to patch the leaks and rebuild the engines, and somehow the vessel remained afloat for another century. By the late Tang, different armed groups controlled different sections of the deck, while the captain possessed little more than symbolic authority. After the storm raised by Huang Chao, the captain invited outside forces aboard to save the ship. In the end, the rescuer, Zhenguan, walked into the cockpit and replaced the flag. Did the ship sink? As the political entity called the Great Tang, yes, it was over. But the technology, books, language, music, institutions, and memories carried aboard that ship were moved onto the ships that followed. That is the difference between dynastic change and civilizational continuity. When we study ancient Chinese history, it is easy to be trapped by the dynastic table. Sui, then Tang, then 5 dynasties, then Song. It looks as if every new dynasty resets everything. Real history never resets. The Grand Canal, institutions, and legacy of reunification built by the Sui flowed into the Tang. Tang fiscal reforms, bureaucratic traditions, urban economies, and cultural achievements flowed into the 5 dynasties and Song. People did not all change the day a new dynasty took the throne. Trade routes did not disappear because an emperor had a different surname. Local families, temples, armies, and markets continued to exist. So to understand the Great Tang, we cannot finish by memorizing a few labels. The Zhenguan reign, Wu Zetian, the Kaiyuan Golden Age, then Lushan Rebellion, regional warlordism, the Huangqiao uprising. Labels are useful for examinations. History is alive. The real Tang was Li Yuan hesitating and then deciding what to do as he read the political collapse of the late Sui. It was Li Shimin gambling everything before Hulao Pass. It was the arrow at Xuanwu Gate that left brothers with no road back. It was Wei Zheng standing before the emperor and saying what the emperor did not want to hear. It was Xuanzong facing loneliness as he crossed the deserts. It was the long road taken by Princess Wenqing's procession toward the Tibetan plateau. And it was Wu Zetian entering a political world that had almost never allowed a woman to stand at the very top, and ultimately writing the word emperor under her own name. The real Tang was also the sound of the pipa drifting through Chang'an at night during Kaiyuan. It was the accents of foreign merchants. It was the anxiety of candidates rushing to the capital for the examinations. It was frontier soldiers looking toward their distant homes. It was Li Bai's reckless confidence that his talent could carry him into the political center, and Du Fu's grief as he watched ordinary families shattered by war. The real Tang was the moment Xuanzong fled Chang'an, perhaps looking back for the last time at the palaces he once controlled. It was the soldiers at Mawei telling an emperor with swords and spears that the balance of power had changed. It was Guizi and Li Guangbi slowly recovering lost territory. It was Liu Yin working between account books and grain boats to find a way to give the state money again. It was Taizong realizing in Fengtian that curbing the regional governors could not be done by willpower alone. It was Li Su's soldiers walking through the snow toward the walls of Kai Prefecture. It was Emperor Wenzong sitting inside the palace knowing that, although he was the son of heaven, he could not escape the eunuchs standing closest to him. The real Tang was also the countless ordinary people caught up as Huang Chao's armies moved across the land. It was a network of salt smugglers turning into a military force capable of resisting the state. It was the enormous irony of Zhenguan, who moved from rebel commander to Tang military governor, and then from complete loyalty to the man who usurped the Tang throne. It was Zhaozong, fully aware that the empire was collapsing, still struggling to save it, and eventually losing even the right to choose where he would die. Only here does the complete story of the Tang finally close its circle. It was born from the collapse caused by an old empire's overmobilization, which is why its early rulers emphasized recovery and order. Its successful reconstruction gave it the capacity to expand, and that expansion changed its military structure. The new military structure turned against the center during the Lushan Rebellion. The court survived by reforming its finances and military arrangements, but those reforms created new balances of power. Those balances prolonged the life of the Tang for another century, yet never restored the level of control enjoyed during the High Tang. When social crisis finally erupted in the form of the Huang Chao uprising, the central government relied on warlords to save itself, and was ultimately swallowed by those same warlords. The Tang was born from the collapse of the Sui, conquered a unified realm through warlords, and finally died at the hands of warlords. That is the Tang's most complete and most dramatic historical circle. But perhaps its greatest meaning lies beyond that circle. The Great Tang showed later generations that an ancient Chinese dynasty could, for a remarkably long time, combine strong central institutions, wide regional connections, and extraordinarily active cultural exchange. It did not create a perfect world. It created a stage large enough for different people's beliefs, languages, and cultures to leave deep traces through conflict and fusion. It made poetry part of the shared historical memory of later China. It turned Chang'an into an urban image that would survive for 1,000 years. And it transformed the High Tang into a symbol of a golden age repeatedly summoned by Chinese culture. But what is truly worth remembering about the High Tang is not simply its gold and splendor. If we love only its prosperity, we will miss the Tang. If we talk only about its openness, we will miss the Tang. If we simply blame in Li Shan, Yang Guozhong, the eunuchs, and Zhenguan, we will still miss the Tang. What is worth watching is the change itself. How a system can generate side effects through its own success. How an empire can adapt after disaster. How people make decisions without knowing the future answer. And how a dynasty can age politically while continuing to produce peaks of culture. In 907, Zhu Xuanzong took the throne, and the name of the Great Tang disappeared. To the people living at that moment, the future was not as clear as saying, "Now comes the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms." They only knew that a familiar order had ended, and no one knew when a new stability would come. Some continued serving in government. Some fled south. Some joined new armies. Some stayed on their farms. Some continued trading. Some copied Buddhist scriptures. Some kept reading Li Bai and Du Fu. The dynasty ended in the histories, but life had to continue the very next day. And it was precisely through that continuation that the Tang never truly left. It entered the political debates of song scholars and the poetry of later writers. It entered artifacts and official traditions preserved across East Asia. It entered the colors of the Dunhuang caves, the countless tombs beneath Xi'an, a stone inscription, a ceramic figure, a silver cup, a fragment of music. Even today, when we walk through Xi'an and see the giant wild goose pagoda and think of Xuanzang, when we see the ruins of the Daming Palace and imagine the former Han Yuan Hall, or when we read the 2 characters Chang'an and automatically picture a distant empire that was prosperous, open, dazzling, and dangerous, we are still living inside the memory left by the Tang. So if someone asks, what exactly was the Tang Dynasty? It was, of course, a dynasty that lasted from 618 to 907. But it was also a demonstration of the extreme capacities of an ancient Chinese empire. It was a vast historical experiment in which cultural exchange and the expansion of political power happened at the same time. It was a 3-century marathon in which prosperity generated new dangers, disaster forced adaptation, and the dynasty struggled stubbornly to survive. Its first half shows how a state can recover from war and rise to power. Its middle years show that the moment of greatest glory can also hide the most dangerous structural changes. Its second half shows that decline is never a simple straight line. A state that has suffered enormous damage can still reform, revive, and create great culture. But once the core resources of power continue to leak away, there eventually comes a day when the broken pieces can no longer be put back together. The last Tang emperor left the stage, but Tang poetry did not. Chang'an lost its status as an imperial capital, but the imagination of Chang'an did not. The banners of Tang armies disappeared, but the influence of Tang institutions and culture did not. So at the very end, we return to the question with which we began. Why did the Great Tang fall? Because over nearly 3 centuries, it kept changing, and the mechanisms that once made it strong gradually became burdens under new conditions. Frontier armies changed from shields into threats. The Imperial Guard changed from the Emperor's protection into a center of palace power. Local revenue changed from a national resource into the capital of warlords. Men who had saved the state from rebellion became new masters of the provinces. No single moment killed the Tang. Crisis after crisis, compromise after compromise, pushed the empire from a position where it could choose actively to one where it could only react. But if we ask again, why was the Great Tang great? Precisely because it kept changing. It could inherit the sway system without simply copying it. It could restore production after chaos. It could recruit talented people from different backgrounds. It could allow cross-border exchange to unfold in cities and along frontiers. It could reform its finances after the disaster of Lushan and survive for another century. And even while its political power declined, it continued to produce literature and art of world-class significance. It was not great because it was perfect. It was great because it was complex. As the final camera rises slowly above Luoyang in 907, we see the new flags of Zhu Xuanzhong's later Lian. Far away, grain is still moving along the waterways. Villages are still being farmed. Scholars are still reciting and reading poetry. Lamps are still being lit inside temples. The old dynasty has ended, but a new world is already taking shape. Then the camera keeps moving west, across the damaged city of Chang'an, across the hushy corridor, along the roads that once led toward the western regions. Then east, across Luoyang, Yangzhou, and the sea, toward the Korean peninsula and the Japanese archipelago. Then across another 1,000 years, all the way back to the present. And we realize that what the Great Tang left behind was not the myth of a golden age that never declined. It left a sense of historical scale. A dynasty could be this vast and still be this fragile, this confident and still this uncertain, capable of the most brutal palace struggles and in the same era, the gentlest poetry, able to project military power across distant frontiers and then be consumed by that very military, capable of dying and yet continuing to live in the language aesthetics. An imagination of generations that followed. This was the Tang Dynasty, a dynasty that rose from the chaos of the late Sui, burned brightly in Chang'an for nearly 3 centuries, illuminated much of the Eurasian world of exchange, and was ultimately scorched by its own fire and extinguished beneath the blades of warlords, yet still sent its afterglow into the next 1,000 years of history. When the final lamp of the Tang Palace goes dark, history does not become black, because that light had already entered the China that came after. I'm Jason from Eastern Historian. I'll see you in the next episode.